The blizzard hit like God's own fist, and Dr. Lillian Price realized with cold certainty that all her Eastern education meant nothing out here. She was trapped, miles from civilization, snowbound in a grieving widower's house with three hollow-eyed boys who flinched at kindness, and a man so broken he could barely meet her eyes. Outside, Wyoming winter buried her equipment, her plans, her entire life. Inside, something far more dangerous was happening. She was starting to feel like she belonged. But women like her didn't stay in places like this. Did they? If you're curious to see where this Christmas storm leads, to heartbreak or healing, I invite you to follow this story all the way through. And please, comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale travels. The train lurched to a stop at Sweetwater Station, and Dr. Lillian Price stepped onto the platform with her specimen cases and a determination that had carried her across half the continent. December wind cut through her wool traveling suit, and she adjusted her hat with gloved fingers, scanning the rough settlement that passed for civilization this far west. Behind her, the conductor heaved her trunk onto the weathered boards with a grunt that suggested Eastern ladies and their baggage were equally unwelcome. "You're sure about this, ma'am?" He wiped his brow despite the cold. "Weather's turning. Might not be another train through for a week or more if the snows come heavy." Lillian offered him a tight smile. "I've come too far to turn back now, sir. My research awaits." The conductor shook his head and climbed back aboard, muttering something about fool Easterners that the wind mercifully carried away. Lillian watched the train pull out with a belch of steam and smoke, and only then did she allow herself a moment of doubt. The settlement consisted of perhaps 24 buildings scattered along a muddy street, a general store, a saloon, a church with peeling paint, and various structures whose purposes she could only guess. Mountains rose in the distance like broken teeth, their peaks lost in gray clouds that hung low and threatening. "Dr. Price?" She turned to find a tall man approaching, his hat pulled low against the wind. He moved with the easy stride of someone who belonged to this harsh landscape, his coat worn but well made, his boots caked with the red mud that seemed to define Wyoming territory. Orchestrated emotional narrative arc with vivid characterization and dialogue. "Mr. McCrae?" She extended her hand with the confidence of a woman who'd fought for every inch of respect in lecture halls, full of men who thought geology was no place for a lady. He took her hand briefly, his grip firm but impersonal. "Jonah McCrae, yes, ma'am. I got your telegram about studying the rock formations on my land." His voice was deep, roughened by wind and something else, something that sounded like years of not using it much. "Wagons this way. We should get moving. Storm's coming." The conductor mentioned that. Lillian fell into step beside him, her shorter legs working to match his pace. "How long until it arrives?" "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be less." He glanced at the sky with the assessing gaze of someone who'd learned to read weather the way she read geological strata. "Out here, winter don't ask permission before it arrives, ma'am. It just comes." They reached a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 draft horses, and Jonah made quick work of loading her trunk and cases. Lillian noted the efficiency of his movements, the way he handled her equipment with surprising care despite his obvious hurry. When he offered his hand to help her onto the seat, she caught a glimpse of his face beneath the hat brim, lean and weathered with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and wind, and a tightness around his mouth that had nothing to do with the weather. "How far is your ranch?" she asked as he climbed up beside her and took the reins. 8 miles northwest. We'll make it before the worst hits if we're lucky." He clicked to the horses, and they pulled away from the station with a creak of leather and wood. For the first few miles, Jonah didn't speak, and Lillian found herself studying the landscape with a geologist's eye and a woman's growing unease. The land stretched wide and empty, broken only by sage and occasional rock outcroppings that promised fascinating formations to study. But the vastness of it pressed against her with an almost physical weight. In Boston, she'd been surrounded by buildings and people, by the comfortable closeness of civilization. Here, the sky went on forever, and a person could shout themselves hoarse without anyone hearing. "You came a long way for rocks, Dr. Price." Jonah's voice startled her from her thoughts. "I came a long way for knowledge, Mr. McCrae. The rock formations in this region are virtually unstudied. There are fossils here that could rewrite our understanding of ancient seas, of the creatures that lived millions of years before. She stopped herself, realizing she was launching into the lecture she'd prepared for university boards that had dismissed her proposals as ambitious for a woman. I apologize. I tend to become enthusiastic about my work. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Nothing wrong with caring about what you do, ma'am. World needs more of that. My colleagues in Boston would argue that a woman's enthusiasm is better directed toward domestic pursuits. The bitterness in her voice surprised even herself. This time Jonah did turn to look at her, his gray eyes sharp with understanding. Sounds like you need new colleagues. Before Lillian could respond, the wind picked up with a sudden violence that made the horses toss their heads. Jonah steadied them with a quiet word, his attention back on the road ahead. Here it comes. Hold on, Dr. Price. The first snowflakes arrived like scouts before an army, fat and wet, melting on Lillian's coat. Within minutes, they multiplied into a white curtain that reduced visibility to mere yards. The temperature dropped so fast she could feel it through her wool layers, and the wind drove the snow horizontal, stinging any exposed skin. Is it always like this? She shouted over the sudden howl. Sometimes worse. Jonah urged the horses faster, and Lillian gripped the seat as the wagon jolted over ruts she could no longer see. Ranch is just ahead. She couldn't see how he knew where they were. Everything had become a whiteout, the world erased by winter's fury. But then buildings materialized from the snow like shapes emerging from fog. A barn, a stable, several outbuildings, and a house that looked solid and weathered, built to withstand exactly this kind of storm. Jonah pulled the wagon up to the porch and jumped down, offering his hand again. Get inside. I'll tend the horses and bring your things. I can help. No offense, ma'am, but you'll freeze before you're useful. Doors unlocked. Boys are inside. Just go on in. His tone left no room for argument, and Lillian recognized the voice of a man accustomed to making decisions in emergencies. She climbed the porch steps as the blizzard intensified and pushed through the door into warmth and lamplight that felt like salvation. The first thing she noticed was the cleanliness. The house was tidy in a way that spoke of effort rather than ease. Floors swept, surfaces clear, everything in its place. The second thing she noticed was the silence. 3 boys sat at a large kitchen table, frozen in the act of eating what looked like beans and cornbread. They stared at her with eyes that were too old for their young faces. The oldest, perhaps 11. The middle one, maybe 8. The youngest, barely 6. All of them had their father's dark hair and lean build, and all of them looked at her with the wary stillness of animals expecting to be hurt. Hello! Lillian removed her hat and shook snow from her coat, trying for a warm smile despite her own discomfort. I'm Dr. Lillian Price. I'm here to study the rocks on your father's land. You must be the McCrae boys. The oldest boy set down his fork with careful precision. I'm Owen. This is Micah and Luke. He nodded to his brothers but didn't elaborate, and the younger 2 didn't speak at all. Luke, the smallest, had his hand wrapped around a tin cup as if it were the only solid thing in the world. The door banged open, and Jonah came in with her trunk on one shoulder and a specimen case under his other arm, snow-coating him like white armor. Boys, help me with Dr. Price's things. Owen, get the other cases from the porch. Micah, stoke the fire in the front room. Luke? He paused, looking at his youngest with something that might have been tenderness or might have been pain. Luke, you finish your supper. The boys moved with practiced efficiency, and Lillian noticed how they orbited their father without ever quite touching him, how they performed their tasks in silence. Within minutes, her equipment was stacked in what Jonah called the front room, a parlor of sorts, with a fireplace, 2 chairs, and a worn sofa that had seen better years. You'll sleep upstairs, second door on the right, Jonah said, shaking snow from his coat. Boys have the other rooms. I'm in the back downstairs. Breakfast is at dawn, supper at dusk. You need anything? Just ask. He paused, seeming to search for something else to say, then simply added, Welcome to the McCrae Ranch, Dr. Price. Thank you, Mr. McCrae, and please call me Lillian. We'll be working together for several weeks. Formality seems unnecessary. Then you can call me Jonah, ma'am. But there was no warmth in the offer, just weary politeness. Storm's likely to last a few days. Hope you brought enough to keep yourself occupied because you won't be going anywhere until it passes. With that, he disappeared toward what she assumed was his bedroom, leaving Lillian standing in the parlor with three silent boys watching her from the kitchen doorway. She took a breath and approached them with the same courage she'd used entering lecture halls full of skeptical men. Well then, since it appears we'll be snowbound together, perhaps you boys could show me where I might find some tea? It's been a very long journey, and I'm quite parched. Owen glanced at his brothers, then back at her. Ma'am, we don't have tea. Just coffee, and water from the well. Coffee will be splendid then. Lillian moved past them into the kitchen, noting the spotless counters, the neatly stacked plates, the general sense of a household running on discipline rather than joy. Do you mind if I make it myself? I have particular preferences about strength. Pa makes it strong enough to stand a spoon in, Micah offered quietly, speaking for the first time. His voice was soft, almost musical. Lillian smiled at him. Then your father and I will get along famously. I prefer my coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Luke's eyes widened at that, and for just a moment, something that might have been amusement flickered across his small face before disappearing behind that careful blankness again. She found the coffee in a pot, working in the unfamiliar kitchen while the boys watched from the table. The wind shrieked around the house, rattling windows, and snow hissed against the glass like thrown sand. Inside, the fire crackled and the lamp flames danced, creating a circle of warmth against the fury outside. Do you really study rocks? Owen asked finally, curiosity overcoming reserve. I do. Rocks and the fossils preserved in them. I'm particularly interested in the layers of sedimentary rock, stone that formed at the bottom of ancient oceans millions of years ago when this entire region was underwater. Wyoming was under the ocean? Micah leaned forward, interest brightening his serious face. Oh yes, long, long ago, before there were people or even dinosaurs, this land was covered by a warm, shallow sea, filled with creatures that would seem alien to us now. When they died, they sank to the bottom and were buried in mud that eventually turned to stone. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we can find their remains preserved as fossils, windows into a world that no longer exists. Like treasure hunting, Luke whispered, his first words. Exactly like treasure hunting. Lillian poured her coffee and sat at the table with them, ignoring the screaming voice in her head that said ladies didn't impose themselves at the kitchen table of strangers. Except the treasure is knowledge, and the map is written in layers of stone. For the next hour, as the storm battered the house and darkness fell outside, Lillian found herself talking about her work in a way she'd never been able to do in Boston. No one here dismissed her enthusiasm as unseemly or suggested she should focus on more appropriate feminine pursuits. The boys listened with the hunger of minds starved for wonder, asking questions that showed genuine intelligence. Even Owen, who seemed to carry the weight of being the oldest like a physical burden, allowed himself moments of boyish excitement. When Jonah emerged from his room, called by the smell of fresh coffee, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and stared at the scene before him. His three sons, who'd been moving through life like ghosts since their mother's death, were leaning forward with bright eyes, peppering this Eastern lady with questions about trilobites and ammonites, and whether you could really find shark teeth in Wyoming. And Lillian, Dr. Price, sat in his wife's chair drinking coffee from his wife's cup, bringing his house to life in a way he'd thought was gone forever. Something in his chest cracked, just a little. Not breaking, but maybe softening. Pa! Micah turned with more animation than Jonah had seen in months. Dr. Price says there used to be an ocean here, with sharks and everything. Is that so? Jonah poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, deliberately not sitting at the table. Seems hard to believe, this far from any coast. The continents weren't always where they are now, Lillian explained, and Jonah noticed she didn't patronize him or assume ignorance. The earth is constantly changing, just very, very slowly. What seems permanent to us is actually fluid, over millions of years. Mountains rise and fall, seas advance and retreat. Nothing is fixed except the fact of change itself. Owen frowned thoughtfully. So even the mountains won't last forever? Even the mountains, though it will take millions of years longer than any human lifetime for them to wear away to nothing. She smiled at the boy. so you needn't worry about them disappearing in your lifetime. Ma said everything changes, Luke said quietly, staring at his cup. She said nothing stays the same, no matter how much we want it to. The warmth drained from the room as if someone had opened a door to the blizzard outside. Micah's face closed like a shuttered window. Owen's shoulders tensed, and Jonah's hand tightened on his coffee cup until Lillian thought the ceramic might crack. Your mother was a wise woman, Lillian said gently, recognizing dangerous ground but refusing to pretend she hadn't heard. Change is the only constant in this world. Sometimes it takes things from us. Sometimes it brings us things we never expected. Jonah set his cup down with more force than necessary. Boys, it's bedtime. School lessons start at 8 tomorrow, storm or no storm. Say goodnight to Dr. Price. They chorused quiet goodnights and disappeared upstairs with the speed of children well-versed in obedience. Lillian listened to their footsteps overhead, then turned to find Jonah watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I apologize if I overstepped, she said carefully. I didn't mean to. You didn't. He moved to the window, looking out at the wall of white beyond the glass. They don't talk much anymore. About her. About anything, really. It was good to hear them laugh, even for a moment. He was quiet for a long beat. She died in May. Fever took her fast, 3 days from first symptom to... He didn't finish. I'm so sorry. Yeah, me too. He turned from the window, and in the lamplight she could see the exhaustion carved into his face, the weight of being both father and mother to 3 grieving boys while carrying his own broken heart. You should get some rest, Dr. Price. Morning comes early on a ranch, and there's work to do regardless of the weather. Of course. Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. McCrae. Jonah. Well, thank you for talking to my boys like they matter. He said it quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the words cost him something to speak aloud. Lillian climbed the stairs to the room he'd indicated, finding it clean and spare, with a bed that had clearly been made with care, a washstand with a pitcher of water, and a window that showed nothing but swirling white. She could hear the boys in the other rooms, the creak of bed frames and whispered conversations cut short by sleep or grief or both. She unpacked her nightgown and prepared for bed, trying not to think about how far she was from everything familiar, how the storm had effectively trapped her here with strangers who carried their sadness like stones in their pockets. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and snow piled against the window in drifts that glowed faintly in the darkness. But inside, wrapped in quilts that smelled of lye soap and wood smoke, Lillian found herself thinking not about her research or her equipment or the weeks of work ahead, but about 3 boys who'd forgotten how to be children and a man who'd forgotten how to hope. When she finally slept, her dreams were filled with ancient seas and fossils preserved in stone, and the sound of young voices asking questions about a world that existed long before grief was invented. The storm showed no signs of abating when Lillian woke to gray dawn light struggling through the snow-plastered window. She dressed quickly in the cold room, choosing her most practical skirt and shirtwaist, and made her way downstairs to find the house already alive with activity. Jonah stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with the efficiency of long practice, while the boys set the table with military precision. They moved around each other in a choreographed dance that spoke of months of routine, each knowing his role without need for instruction. Good morning, Lillian offered from the doorway. Morning, Dr. Price. Jonah didn't look up from the griddle. Coffee's hot. Breakfast in 5 minutes. Owen pulled out a chair for her. His mother had clearly taught him manners. And Lillian found herself seated at the family table as if she belonged there, which was absurd. She was a scientist, here to study geological formations, not to play house with a grieving widower and his sons. Yet when Jonah placed a plate of pancakes before her, golden and steaming, and Luke passed her the syrup with a shy smile, something in her chest tightened with an emotion she couldn't name. What are your plans for the day, Dr. Price? Jonah asked once they were all seated. Grace said in quick, quiet words that had the feel of habit rather than faith. I'd hoped to begin surveying the rock outcroppings you mentioned in your telegram, but she gestured toward the window, where snow continued to fall in thick sheets. I suppose that's impossible in this weather. Impossible and fatal, Jonah agreed. No one goes out in a blizzard like this unless they're a fool with a death wish. You'll have to content yourself with indoor pursuits until it passes. When do you think that might be? He studied the window with that same assessing gaze he'd used yesterday. Could be today, could be 3 days from now. Weather out here doesn't follow schedules or preferences. Then I suppose I'll occupy myself with cataloging my equipment and reviewing my research notes. It sounded painfully dull even to her own ears, but what choice did she have? You could help us with school lessons, Micah said suddenly, then looked startled at his own boldness. Jonah's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Micah, I'd be delighted, Lillian interrupted, surprising herself. What are you studying? Pa teaches us reading, writing, and arithmetic, Owen explained, and Bible verses on Sundays. Ma used to. She taught us other things, history and geography, poetry sometimes. His voice grew softer with each sentence until it nearly disappeared. I'm not much good at poetry, Jonah said gruffly, and my geography ends at the Wyoming border. They learn what I can teach them, which is enough for ranch life. But not enough for curious minds, Lillian said gently, seeing the hunger in the boys' faces. If you'd permit it, I'd be happy to supplement their education while I'm here. I have books in my cases, natural history, geology, even some literature, and stories from my travels. She looked directly at Jonah. Knowledge is never wasted, even on a ranch. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw the war behind his eyes, the desire to give his sons something more battling against the fear of letting another person into their lives, someone else who might leave and take pieces of their hearts with her. All right, he said finally, but ranch work comes first. They have chores, same as always. Of course. Lillian found herself smiling at the boy's barely contained excitement. Education should never interfere with responsibility. After breakfast, while Jonah bundled up to check on the livestock in the barn, Lillian helped the boys clear the table and wash dishes. They worked well together, she noticed, each boy knowing his task without being told. But there was no joy in it, just the mechanical performance of duty. Do you boys always work this quietly? She asked, passing a plate to Owen for drying. Pa likes things quiet, Owen said carefully. Says idle chatter is just noise. Lillian considered this. And what does idle chatter sound like exactly? Micah giggled, an unexpected, delightful sound that made Owen's eyes widen in surprise. Like Luke when he sees a grasshopper. He talks to them like they understand him. They might understand, Luke protested, his small face serious. You don't know they don't. That's an excellent point, Luke. Scientists once thought animals couldn't communicate at all, and now we know many species have complex languages we're only beginning to understand. Lillian dried her hands and looked at the three boys. Your father values quiet, and that's his right in his own home. But in my experience, the best learning happens when questions and observations are spoken aloud. So during our lessons, you're permitted, encouraged, even to talk, to question, to wonder. Does that sound agreeable? The cautious hope on their faces made her chest ache. They settled in the parlor, where Lillian opened her specimen cases with the reverence of a priest unveiling sacred relics. Inside lay carefully wrapped fossils, rock samples, magnifying glasses, notebooks filled with sketches and observations, and various tools of her trade. The boys crowded close, eyes wide with wonder at this glimpse into a world beyond their ranch. This, Lillian said, unwrapping a particular treasure, is a trilobite fossil. This creature lived about 400 million years ago in the ancient sea that covered this region. She placed it in Owen's hands, and the boy stared at it with something approaching awe. It's so perfect, like it was carved. In a way, it was. By time and pressure and the miraculous process of fossilization, when this trilobite died, it was quickly buried in fine sediment that protected its body from scavengers. Over millions of years, minerals seeped into its structure, replacing the organic material with stone while preserving every tiny detail. What you're holding is both the trilobite and not the trilobite, a perfect stone ghost of a creature that lived when life was still learning how to exist on land. Can we find these here? Micah's fingers traced the segmented body with careful reverence. On our ranch? Quite possibly. The geological survey maps suggest the formations on your property are from the right time period. That's why I'm here, to see what secrets the stone has kept. Luke, the youngest, had been rummaging through the case with the unselfconscious curiosity of a child. He held up something wrapped in cloth. "What's this one?" Lillian took it carefully and unwrapped it to reveal a piece of petrified wood, the grain still visible but transformed entirely to stone. "This is wood from a tree that grew perhaps 50 million years ago. The organic material has been completely replaced by minerals, often silica, while maintaining the wood's original structure. It's not wood anymore, not really, but it remembers being wood in every detail." "Like a memory made solid," Owen said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made Lillian look at him sharply. "Yes, exactly like that." She met his serious gaze and understood what he wasn't saying, that he was trying to hold on to memories of his mother, to keep them solid and unchanging like stone, while they grew more fragile and fluid each day. They spent the morning examining fossils and discussing deep time, the unfathomable stretches of years that geology required one to comprehend. Lillian found herself teaching not from a prepared curriculum, but following the boys' questions wherever they led, delighting in their quick minds and genuine curiosity. Owen wanted to understand how mountains formed. Micah was fascinated by the idea of climate change over geological time. Luke simply loved the fossils themselves, the tangible proof that strange and wonderful creatures had once existed. When Jonah came in from the barn, stamping snow from his boots, he found them all gathered around the kitchen table with fossils spread across the surface like pieces of a puzzle, and his sons talking over each other in their excitement to share what they'd learned. He stood in the doorway, unwrapping his scarf slowly, and simply listened. Owen was explaining tectonic plates with the confidence of a professor. Micah was arguing passionately about whether the trilobite could see colors. Luke was making Lillian promise they could hunt for fossils once the storm cleared. And Lillian, Dr. Price, sat in the center of this small whirlwind, her hair slightly disheveled, her face bright with enthusiasm, answering questions and asking new ones, treating his sons not as children to be managed, but as fellow scholars worthy of serious discussion. "Pa!" Luke spotted him first. "Dr. Price says we might have ocean fossils right here on our ranch. Can we look for them? Please?" "We'll see," Jonah said automatically, the answer he gave to most of Luke's enthusiasms. "Depends on the weather and the work that needs doing." "Of course," Lillian added quickly, reading the concern in his expression. "Any fossil hunting would have to work around ranch responsibilities. I wouldn't dream of interfering with essential work." Jonah nodded stiffly and moved to prepare lunch. More coffee, yesterday's bread, some dried beef. The boys helped put away the fossils with the careful reverence of those handling treasures, and Lillian noticed how they'd absorbed her handling techniques, supporting each specimen with both hands, placing them gently in their padded cases. They ate lunch in relative quiet, but it was a different quality of silence than breakfast. Not empty, but full of thoughts and questions waiting to be spoken. Afterwards, Jonah insisted the boys do their arithmetic, and Lillian retreated to the parlor to work on her research notes, trying to ignore the drift of Jonah's deep voice as he guided them through multiplication tables with patient repetition. By evening, the storm had intensified. Wind drove the snow sideways with such violence that the house shuddered under the assault. Jonah checked every window, stuffed rags under the doors, and added extra wood to the fires until the interior was almost too warm, a necessary defense against the killing cold outside. "We're burning through wood faster than I'd like," he muttered, staring at the depleting stack beside the fireplace. "But there's no choice. House drops below freezing, pipes burst, and then we're in real trouble." "Is there enough?" Lillian asked, trying not to sound as worried as she felt. "Should be, if the storm doesn't last more than another day or two." He didn't sound entirely convinced. That night at supper, rabbit stew that Jonah had clearly made dozens of times, the recipe memorized through repetition, Luke asked Lillian about Boston. "What's it like in a big city? Do you see the ocean?" "Boston sits right on Massachusetts Bay, so yes, you can see the ocean every day if you like. The harbor is full of ships from all over the world, tall masted vessels and steamships, fishing boats and naval vessels. The smell of salt and fish is everywhere." "Do you miss it?" Micah asked. Lillian considered this. "I miss certain things. The museums and libraries where I can study specimens from around the world. The lectures and the chance to discuss ideas with other scientists. She paused. But Boston is also crowded and loud, and often quite dirty. The air is thick with coal smoke and the noise never stops. You can't see the stars at night because of all the lights and haze. I'd like to see it someday, Owen said quietly. The museums, at least. Then you should, Lillian told him. A curious mind shouldn't be confined by geography. Travel broadens understanding in ways books never can. Travel requires money, Jonah said flatly, which ranch life doesn't provide in abundance. Owen's future is here, on this land. All the boys' futures are here. Something in his tone suggested this was an old argument, or at least an old tension. Owen's face closed, and he didn't speak again during the meal. After supper, while the boys played a subdued game of checkers, Jonah and Lillian found themselves alone in the kitchen under the pretense of cleaning up. I didn't mean to put ideas in his head, Lillian said quietly, washing plates with more attention than necessary. Ideas were already there. His mother— Jonah stopped, corrected himself. Sarah used to talk about the wider world. She'd been to school in Denver, read books I've never heard of. She wanted more for them than this. He gestured vaguely at the ranch beyond the walls. But this is what I have to give them. This land, this life. It's honest work and it's ours, but it's not— Again he stopped, unable or unwilling to finish. It's not what she wanted, Lillian supplied gently. No, it wasn't. He dried the last plate and hung the towel with precise care. She made her choice when she married me, came out here from the city. But I always wondered if she regretted it, especially toward the end when the fever had her and she knew she was dying. She kept saying she was sorry, over and over, sorry for leaving them, for leaving me. But I think— His voice cracked slightly. I think maybe she was also sorry she'd ever come here in the first place. The raw pain in those words hung between them like a living thing. Lillian wanted to offer comfort, but knew there was none sufficient for that kind of wound, the knowledge that the person you loved might have mourned the life they'd given up for you. Children need roots and wings both, she said finally. Your land gives them roots, stability, purpose, connection to something larger than themselves. But they'll also need wings eventually, even if those wings bring them right back here. Trying to clip them early won't make them any safer, Jonah. It'll just make them smaller. Speaking from experience? There was an edge to his voice, but also genuine curiosity. My father is a minister in Boston. He wanted me to marry a nice young man from the congregation, produce grandchildren, and occupy myself with charitable works. Perfectly respectable life for a woman of my class. She smiled tightly. Instead, I went to university, one of 3 women in a program of 200 men, and fought for every scrap of knowledge they were willing to share. My father still introduces me to eligible bachelors every time I come home, certain I'll eventually see reason and abandon this peculiar phase. But you haven't. No, because I refuse to make myself smaller to fit someone else's vision of what I should be. The work I do matters. Not to everyone, perhaps, but to me, and to the understanding of this earth we all share. I won't apologize for wanting to be part of that understanding. Jonah studied her in the lamplight, seeing perhaps for the first time not an inconvenient stranger, but a woman who'd fought her own battles against expectations and limitations. Sarah would have liked you, he said finally. She would have liked your fireside. Before Lillian could respond, a crash from the parlor sent them both rushing toward the sound. They found Micah standing frozen by the window, his face white, the checker game forgotten. Micah? What's wrong? Jonah reached his son in 3 strides. The boy pointed at the window with a shaking hand. I thought I saw— out there in the snow. For just a second it looked like— He couldn't finish, tears tracking down his face. Like what, son? Like Mama, standing in the snow, watching the house. His voice broke on a sob. I know it wasn't. I know she's gone. But for a second I really thought— Jonah pulled his son into his arms, and the boy collapsed against him, weeping with the kind of grief that had clearly been held back too long. Owen and Luke watched with stricken faces, their own tears starting to fall. It's all right, Jonah murmured, his voice rough. It's all right to see her sometimes, To think you hear her. That doesn't make you foolish, son. That makes you human." Lillian stood apart, feeling like an intruder on this moment of raw family grief. But when Luke turned to her with streaming eyes and said, "Do you think she can see us? From heaven? Do you think she knows we miss her?" She couldn't simply stand there silent. She knelt beside him, taking his small, cold hands in hers. "I think love doesn't end just because life does. The love your mother had for you, that's still here, Luke. In every memory you carry, in every lesson she taught you, in the way your father cares for you just as she would have wanted. Death took her body, but it couldn't take what really mattered, the love itself. That's yours forever." "But I can't remember her face anymore," Luke whispered. "Not all the time. Sometimes I try really hard and I can't. That's because you're trying to remember with your mind instead of your heart. Close your eyes." Lillian waited until he did. "Now think about how you felt when she tucked you in at night. Don't try to see her face, just remember how safe and loved you felt. Can you remember that feeling?" Luke nodded, new tears squeezing from beneath his closed lids. "That feeling is your mother, Luke. More real than any face could ever be. That's what death can't touch." The wind howled around the house like all the grief in the world given voice, and in the warm lamplight of the parlor, 4 people who'd lost too much held on to each other while a stranger who understood more about loss than she'd admitted stood witness to their pain. When the boys finally settled enough for bed, Jonah walked them upstairs himself, taking longer than usual with each one. Lillian could hear the murmur of his voice through the ceiling, the quiet conversation with each son, the fatherly rituals of comfort and routine. When he came back down, she had fresh coffee waiting. "Thank you," he said simply, taking the cup. "For what you said to Luke about Sarah, that was..." He struggled for words. "That was kind." It was true. Lillian wrapped her hands around her own cup, seeking warmth. "I lost my mother when I was 12, to consumption. For years I tried to hold on to the image of her face, terrified I'd forget. But what I remember most clearly now isn't how she looked, but how she made me feel, cherished, capable, worthy of taking up space in the world. That gift shaped everything I became." "Is that why you do this? The geology, the traveling, all of it? Because she made you believe you could?" "Partly. And partly because I can't seem to make myself fit into the life everyone else thinks I should want." She smiled wryly. "Your son Owen is not so different from me, I think. He'll try to be what you need him to be, but the wondering will eat at him if he never gets the chance to see what else is possible. And if what's possible just brings him pain, if he goes out into that wide world and finds it doesn't want him any more than it wanted his mother when she tried to be something beyond a ranch wife, then he'll have tried and known, and that's still better than spending his life wondering what if." Lillian met his gaze steadily. "Fear makes us small, Jonah. And your sons deserve the chance to be as large as they're capable of becoming." He was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee as if answers might be found in its dark depths. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, but the violence seemed almost distant now, a backdrop to the more complex storms of grief and fear and hope that swirled through the house. "You're probably right," he said finally. "Doesn't make it easier." "No. Being right rarely makes things easier." They sat in companionable silence until the fire burned low and sleep could no longer be avoided. When Lillian climbed the stairs to her room, she found an extra quilt folded at the foot of her bed. Jonah's silent acknowledgement that the night would be bitter cold, and his quiet assurance that she wouldn't suffer for it. She wrapped herself in wool and down and listened to the house settle around her, the creak of old wood and the whisper of wind through cracks, and somewhere below, the sound of Jonah checking the fires one last time before seeking his own cold bed. Tomorrow the storm might break, or it might rage on for days. But tonight, in this house full of grief and fossilized hearts, something had shifted. Small as a trilobite, ancient as stone, but undeniably real. And Lillian found herself hoping, despite every practical reason not to, that when the snow finally stopped falling, she wouldn't be quite so eager to begin her journey home. The storm raged for 3 more days. On the second morning, Lillian woke to find the world transformed into something alien and hostile. Snow had drifted against the north side of the house in waves that reached past the lower windows, and the barn was barely visible through the white curtain that continued to fall. When she came downstairs, she found Jonah already dressed for the cold, wrapping his face in layers of wool. "I have to check the livestock," he said without preamble. "Owen will come with me. We've got a rope strung from the porch to the barn door, only way to keep from getting lost in whiteout conditions. We'll be back within the hour." "Is it safe?" The question was out before Lillian could stop herself, and she saw Jonah's mouth tighten. "No. But cattle don't care about safety, and they'll die without water and feed. Owen, get your gear." The 11-year-old emerged from the kitchen, already bundled in layers that made him look twice his size. He moved with the calm competence of someone who'd done this before, checking his father's wrappings and accepting Jonah's check of his own without complaint. They were a team, Lillian realized, forged by necessity and loss into something that functioned with minimal words. "Micah, Luke, you stay inside with Dr. Price. Keep the fires going. We'll be back soon." Jonah's hand lingered on Luke's head for just a moment, and then he and Owen pushed out into the screaming white. The door slammed behind them, and the house felt suddenly vast and empty despite having 3 people in it. Micah moved immediately to the fireplace, adding wood with practiced efficiency. Luke stood at the window, his small face pressed against the glass, watching until his father and brother disappeared completely into the storm. "They've done this before," Lillian said, hoping it sounded reassuring rather than questioning. "Every storm," Micah confirmed, not looking up from his work. "Pa says ranching means doing what needs doing, regardless of weather or wanting. Owen's been going with him since Mama—" He stopped, corrected himself. "Since last spring." Since Owen became the oldest, Lillian understood. Since an 11-year-old boy had to become a man before he'd finished being a child. "Your father's very skilled," she said, moving to the kitchen to start coffee, needing to occupy her hands with something useful. "I'm sure they'll be fine." Ma thought she'd be fine too. Luke's voice was small and matter-of-fact, the way children speak truths that adults work hard to avoid. She said it was just a little fever, nothing to worry about. And then she was gone. The coffee forgotten, Lillian knelt beside him at the window. "Luke, what happened to your mother was terrible and frightening, and it's taught you that bad things can happen suddenly. But your father knows this land, knows this weather. He's not taking foolish risks. He's doing what he's trained for. There's a difference between a fever that strikes without warning and a storm you can prepare for." "But you can't prepare for everything," the boy insisted, his eyes never leaving the white void outside. "Bad things still happen even when you're careful." "Yes, sometimes they do. But if we let fear of what might happen stop us from living, then we're not really alive at all. We're just waiting. And that's no way to spend the time we have." Micah had come to stand beside them. "Is that why you came here, even though it's dangerous and far from home? Because you didn't want to just wait?" Lillian looked at these 2 boys, so serious and old beyond their years, and decided they deserved an honest answer. "I came here because staying in Boston meant making myself smaller every day. Means listening to men tell me my work doesn't matter because I'm a woman. Means watching opportunities go to less qualified people simply because they fit what society expects. I came here because sometimes the only way to prove you belong somewhere is to go there and refuse to leave until the world admits you were right." "Were you scared?" Luke asked. "Terrified. Still am, sometimes. But being scared doesn't mean you're doing the wrong thing. Sometimes it just means you're doing something that matters enough to be frightening." The hour Jonah had promised stretched into 90 minutes before the door finally opened and 2 snow-encrusted figures stumbled inside on a blast of Arctic air. Lillian rushed to help them out of their frozen layers, while Micah brought hot coffee and Luke dragged blankets from the sitting room. "Cattle are fine," Jonah reported through chattering teeth. "Barn solid. But we lost 3 chickens, froze before we could get to them. And one of the water troughs cracked from the cold." "I'll fix it tomorrow if the storm breaks," Owen added, his young face red and raw from the wind despite all his wrappings. Lillian wanted to protest that an 11-year-old shouldn't have to repair frozen troughs in sub-zero weather, but she caught herself. These weren't Boston children playing at responsibility. These were frontier sons learning survival from a father who had no choice but to teach them young, or risk losing them to the harsh realities of Wyoming winters. Instead, she said, "Then we should make sure you have a warm meal and proper rest so you're ready for tomorrow's work. What can I do to help?" Jonah looked at her with something like surprise, as if he'd expected criticism rather than support. "There's venison that needs cooking for supper, and bread dough that should be rising in the pantry. Sarah always—" He stopped, redirected. "The bread needs to be shaped and baked." "I can manage that." Lillian spoke with more confidence than she felt. Her domestic skills were adequate, but hardly impressive. She'd spent more time studying than cooking. But she'd watched her mother make bread countless times, and surely she could remember the basics. She couldn't. The first loaves emerged from the oven 2 hours later looking more like geological specimens than food, dense as rocks, burnt on the bottom, raw in the middle. Lillian stared at them with the same dismay she might feel discovering a ruined fossil specimen. "Well," she said to the 4 males watching her failure with various degrees of sympathy, "I appear to have created a new form of sedimentary rock. Perhaps it will fossilize nicely in a few million years." Luke giggled. Micah tried to hide his smile. Owen looked torn between politeness and honesty. Jonah picked up one of the loaves, tested its weight, and set it down with a decisive thunk. "I've seen better bread used for doorstops." But there was something almost fond in his voice, a softness that took the sting from the words. "In my defense," Lillian said with as much dignity as she could muster, "I'm much better at identifying ancient organisms than producing edible food. My skills lie in analysis, not creation." "Lucky for you, I can make bread." Jonah moved past her to check the dough. "And lucky for me, you can teach my boys about ancient oceans. Seems we each have our uses." It was said lightly, almost teasingly, and Lillian felt something warm unfurl in her chest that had nothing to do with the kitchen fire. When was the last time someone had acknowledged her skills as valuable rather than peculiar? When had anyone suggested her education was useful rather than unseemly? They ate venison stew with biscuits Jonah produced with the ease of long practice, and afterwards, while the storm continued its assault, they settled into an evening routine that was becoming almost comfortable. Jonah worked on mending harness leather by lamplight, his hands steady and skilled. Owen studied the arithmetic problems his father had set, while Micah and Luke begged Lillian for more fossil stories. "Tell us about the biggest one you ever found," Luke demanded, settling beside her on the worn sofa like he'd done it 100 times before. "The biggest?" Lillian considered. "That would be a section of marine reptile spine I helped excavate in Kansas 2 years ago. The creature it came from, we call them mosasaurs, was possibly 40 feet long when it lived. Imagine a lizard the size of this house, swimming through ancient seas, hunting fish and smaller reptiles with jaws that could crush bone." 40 feet? Micah's eyes widened. "Like a sea monster?" "Exactly like a sea monster, except this one was real, and when it died and sank to the ocean floor, sediment buried it, layer by layer, until millions of years later, we found it again, still preserved in stone." She leaned forward, warming to her subject. "That's the miracle of fossils. They're messages from a world so distant in time that it might as well be another planet. Every bone, every shell, every trace tells us something about life that existed before humans, before mammals, before anything we'd recognize as familiar." "Did you name it?" Luke asked. "The sea monster?" "We called the specimen Big Bertha, though I'm sure the scientists who published the paper gave it a more dignified designation. But yes, in the field, we name our finds. It makes them feel less like objects and more like old friends, I suppose. Ancient voices we're privileged to hear." "I'd like to hear those voices," Micah said quietly. "I'd like to know what it was like, living in a different time, when everything was different and new." Jonah looked up from his leatherwork, and Lillian saw him studying his middle son with an expression that mixed pride and pain. "Change doesn't always mean better, Micah. Sometimes the old ways are old because they work. But sometimes things need to change," Lillian said gently, "or they become fossils themselves, beautiful relics of what once lived, but no longer part of the world that exists now." The look Jonah gave her was complicated, layered with meanings she couldn't quite parse. But he didn't argue, just returned his attention to the harness with perhaps more force than necessary. That night, after the boys had gone to bed and the storm howled unabated, Jonah and Lillian found themselves alone in the kitchen again, the routine becoming familiar. He made coffee while she washed the supper dishes. They moved around each other with increasing ease, the awkwardness of strangers giving way to something more comfortable. "You're good with them," Jonah said finally, breaking the companionable silence. "The boys. You don't talk down to them like most adults do. They're intelligent children with curious minds. It would be insulting to treat them as anything less." Lillian dried a plate and added it to the stack. "Though I confess my own education didn't prepare me for actual domestic competence, as my bread-shaped rocks proved." A sound escaped Jonah that might have been a laugh, rusty with disuse. "Sarah couldn't cook worth a damn when we married either, burnt everything she touched for the first 6 months. But she learned." His smile faded. "She learned everything this life required, even when it meant giving up things she wanted." "What did she give up?" "Teaching. She'd trained as a school teacher in Denver, had a position waiting for her when we met. But I was heading to Wyoming to claim land, and she, He set down his coffee cup, staring at his work-roughened hands. "I told her I loved her but couldn't give her city life. That my future was here, building something from nothing. And she chose me anyway. Gave up her school, her plans, everything she'd worked for." Did she regret it?" "I used to think no. She seemed happy here, loved the boys, made this house a home. But toward the end, when the fever had her delirious, she kept apologizing, not just for dying, but for choosing wrong, for thinking love was enough when maybe it wasn't." Lillian turned to face him fully. "Jonah, fever makes people say things that aren't true. The guilt, the fear, they distort everything. Your wife chose you because she loved you and wanted the life you could build together. That her life ended too soon doesn't mean the choice was wrong." "How can you know that? You never met her." "Because I know what it's like to make choices that everyone else questions. Every time I choose my work over marriage, my research over respectability, I'm told I'll regret it. That I'm throwing away my chance at happiness for something that doesn't matter." She met his eyes steadily. "But I won't regret it, Jonah. Because living according to someone else's definition of happiness isn't living at all. If your Sarah chose this life, she chose it with eyes open, knowing what she was trading. The fact that it ended in tragedy doesn't invalidate the love and joy that came before." He was quiet for a long moment, processing this. "You said you choose work over marriage. Does that mean there was someone?" "Several someones over the years. Good men, mostly, who wanted wives that would reflect well on them at dinner parties and produce heirs for their family names. Men who liked the idea of a clever wife but found the reality exhausting." She smiled without humor. "The last one told me I needed to decide whether I wanted to be a woman or a scientist, as if the two were mutually exclusive." "That's foolish." Jonah's voice carried an edge of anger. "You're both, obviously." "Obviously to you, perhaps. But to the world I come from, a woman who pursues knowledge as aggressively as I do is considered unnatural, unwomanly, a cautionary tale about what happens when females are given too much education." "Then the world you come from is full of idiots." This time Lillian did laugh, surprised by his bluntness. "Yes, it absolutely is." They finished the dishes in silence, but it was a different quality now, warmer, more companionable. Two people who'd been told they didn't fit discovering that maybe they fit each other better than either expected. When Lillian climbed the stairs that night, she found herself pausing outside the boys' rooms. Through Owen's door, she could hear him reading quietly to his younger brothers, his young voice carrying the story with surprising skill. The tale was from one of her books, Adventure and Exploration, Heroes Discovering New Worlds. "Do you think we'll ever see things like that?" Luke's sleepy voice drifted through the crack in the door. "Faraway places and amazing things?" "Maybe," Owen said, and there was longing in his voice that broke Lillian's heart. "Pa needs us here. But maybe someday, when we're grown, I think Mama would want us to see the world," Micah added. "She always said there was more to life than what you could see from your own porch." "Pa doesn't like when we talk like that." Owen's tone held warning and sadness both. "He thinks we want to leave him." "I don't want to leave," Luke protested. "I just want to know things, see things, and then come home and tell Pa about them." That's the thing about growing up, Owen said with wisdom beyond his years. Everyone leaves eventually, even when you don't want to, even when it hurts. Lillian retreated to her room before they could hear her presence, but Owen's words echoed in her mind. Everyone leaves eventually, even when it hurts. Was that what Jonah feared? That his sons would grow up and discover the world was larger than this ranch, more alluring than the life he could offer? That they'd leave him alone with his grief and his cattle and his memories of a wife who maybe wished she'd made different choices? She lay awake listening to the storm and thinking about all the ways people could be trapped by weather, by obligation, by fear of disappointing those they loved. And she thought about herself, trapped by expectations and dismissals in Boston, only to find herself potentially trapped again here by the growing weight of attachment to 3 boys who weren't hers and a man who carried too much sorrow to leave room for anything else. The storm broke on the 4th morning. Lillian woke to silence so profound it was almost disturbing after days of constant wind. She rushed to the window and found a world transformed, every surface buried under snow that glittered like diamonds in the weak winter sun. The sky was pale blue and clear, painfully bright after days of gray fury. Downstairs, she found the boys already outside, whooping and playing in snow that reached their waists in the drifts. Their laughter rang across the frozen landscape like bells, bright and wild and free, in a way they never were inside the house. Even Owen had abandoned his serious demeanor to pelt Micah with snowballs, while Luke tried to build a snow fort and kept sinking into the soft powder. Jonah stood on the porch watching them, and when Lillian joined him, he didn't speak for a long moment. "I'd forgotten they could sound like that," he said finally. "Like regular boys. Happy boys. They are happy, here, with you. They just also carry sadness, same as you do. One doesn't cancel out the other. Sarah used to make them play outside every day, no matter the weather. Said children needed wild time to stay human. I've been so focused on keeping them safe, keeping routines, keeping everything from falling apart, that I forgot about joy." His voice was rough with emotion. "Thank you for reminding me. I did nothing. The storm broke and they went outside like children have done since the beginning of time." "No." He turned to look at her directly. "You gave them something to be excited about again, something to wonder at. Before you came, they moved through days like little ghosts, just existing. Now they ask questions, they laugh, He struggled for words. "They're alive again, and I'd forgotten what that looked like." Before Lillian could respond, Luke's shriek of delight cut through the air as he finally succeeded in building a wall of snow tall enough to hide behind. His triumph was short-lived. Owen and Micah immediately began a coordinated assault that had him scrambling and laughing. "I should check the damage," Jonah said reluctantly, clearly torn between duty and the desire to simply watch his sons play. "Livestock buildings, fences, storm like that could have caused problems I'll need to fix before the next one hits. May I come with you?" The words surprised Lillian as much as they seemed to surprise Jonah. "I'd like to see the land in winter, and I promise to stay out of your way." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You'll need warmer clothes than what you brought. Sarah's winter gear is still in the storage room. Might fit you well enough." 20 minutes later, Lillian found herself bundled in wool and fur that carried the faint scent of lavender and wood smoke. Another woman's clothes, another woman's life, wrapped around her like a borrowed skin. The coat fit well enough, the boots only slightly too large. She caught Jonah looking at her with an expression she couldn't read, and wondered if seeing her in his dead wife's clothing was painful or simply strange. They set out across the snow, moving slowly through drifts that sometimes reached their knees. The boys wanted to come, but Jonah insisted they stay close to the house, and Owen accepted the responsibility of watching his brothers with the seriousness of a deputy given charge of a town. The barn had weathered the storm well, though snow had blown through every crack and gap to frost the interior with white. The cattle were restless but healthy, their breath creating clouds in the cold air. Jonah moved among them with practiced ease, checking hooves and hides, distributing feed with the efficiency of routine. "You raise these from calves?" Lillian asked, watching him work. "Some. Others I bought from neighbors, built the herd slowly. Takes years to establish a ranch. The land, the buildings, the livestock. This place represents everything Sarah and I worked for. He paused by a particularly large steer, running his hand along its flank. She named this one Goliath, said any cow that size deserved a biblical name. She sounds like she had a sense of humor. She did. Quick wit, sharp tongue when she was riled. The boys get that from her, their cleverness, their curiosity. I just teach them how to survive. She taught them how to think. They continued their inspection, checking fences half buried in snow, noting places where drifts had pushed against structures with enough force to cause damage. Jonah made mental notes of repairs needed, and Lillian found herself fascinated by his knowledge of this land, the way he read snow patterns and wind damage like she read geological strata. You do know things, she said impulsively, important things. The boys learn more from you than just survival. They learn dedication, responsibility, how to care for living things that depend on you. That's not nothing, Jonah. It's not university learning. It's not books and fossils and ideas that could change the world. It's knowledge that keeps your family alive and fed in one of the harshest environments on Earth, that changes their world every single day. She stopped walking, forcing him to turn and face her. Stop measuring yourself against some imaginary standard of what education should be. You're teaching your sons to be capable, thoughtful men. That matters. He held her gaze, and something passed between them, understanding, recognition, the acknowledgement of two people who'd both felt inadequate in different ways for different reasons. You're unusual, Dr. Price. His voice was quiet but not unkind. I can't decide if that's good or dangerous. Probably both, Lillian admitted. Most interesting things are. They walked back to the house in companionable silence, and when they crested the small rise that gave them a full view of the ranch, Lillian stopped to simply look. The homestead sat in a shallow valley, protected from the worst winds, with the mountains rising in the distance like ancient guardians. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the boys had built an elaborate snow fort complete with walls and towers. The scene was achingly beautiful, harsh and wild, and somehow exactly right. I can see why you chose this, she said softly. It's magnificent. It's hard and lonely, and it killed my wife. Jonah's voice was flat. Don't romanticize it, Dr. Price. This land takes more than it gives. Maybe, but it also gives freedom that cities never could. Space to breathe, room to build something that's entirely yours. That has value too. He didn't respond, but she thought she saw his shoulders relax slightly, some small defense lowered. That afternoon, while Jonah worked on repairs, Lillian kept her promise to the boys. The weather was clear enough for a fossil hunt, and she led them to the rock outcroppings she'd spotted from the wagon during their arrival. The formations were partially exposed by wind-scoured areas where snow hadn't accumulated as deeply, and Lillian's trained eye immediately identified promising layers. Here, she said, kneeling beside a section of shale that showed clear stratification. See how the rock is layered? Each layer represents a different time period, thousands or millions of years compressed into stone. We want to look for irregularities in the layers, places where the pattern breaks or something is preserved in the rock. The boys spread out along the outcropping, their earlier wildness giving way to focused concentration. Owen worked methodically, examining each layer with patience. Micah moved more intuitively, drawn to areas that felt right. Luke simply looked for anything unusual, collecting interesting stones with the undiscriminating enthusiasm of a 6-year-old treasure hunter. Dr. Price! Micah's voice cracked with excitement. I found something! Lillian hurried to his side and felt her heart skip. Embedded in the shale, preserved in perfect detail, was a fossilized fern frond, delicate, ancient, beautiful. Micah, this is extraordinary. This plant grew perhaps 300 million years ago, and here it is, every detail preserved. I found it? His face glowed with pride and wonder. Really found it? You really did. And with your permission, I'd like to carefully extract it and add it to my collection, with full credit to you as the discoverer. Can I keep it instead? His voice was small, uncertain. Would that be all right? Lillian looked at the fossil, then at the boy's hopeful face, and made a decision that would have horrified her Boston colleagues. Of course you can keep it. You found it on your land, and it means more to you than it ever could in some museum collection. But let me show you how to carefully extract and preserve it so it lasts. She spent the next hour teaching the boys proper fossil collection techniques, and by the time the sun began to sink toward the horizon, each boy had found something. Micah his fern, Owen a section of rock with clear ripple marks from ancient water, Luke several small fossils he couldn't identify but loved anyway. They trudged back to the house as the temperature dropped, with the setting sun, and found Jonah had supper ready. Actual edible stew and bread, coffee for the adults, and milk for the boys. The table conversation was animated in a way Lillian suspected it hadn't been since Sarah's death, with the boys talking over each other about fossils and ancient plants and whether dinosaurs had lived in Wyoming. They did, Lillian confirmed, though we'd need to find much older rocks to find dinosaur fossils. What you found today is from a time before dinosaurs, when the largest land animals were amphibians and early reptiles. Dinosaurs came later. How much later? Owen asked. Perhaps 100 million years later. Deep time is difficult to comprehend. The numbers become almost meaningless because human minds aren't built to understand millions and billions of years. But imagine every year of your life as one thin page in a book. A book containing all of Earth's history would be so large you couldn't lift it, and all of human history would be just the last few pages. Luke frowned, trying to process this. So we're very small. In terms of time, yes, but also significant because we're the first species that can understand deep time, can look back across those billions of years and piece together the story of how we got here. That makes us unique in all of Earth's history. Sarah used to say something similar, Jonah said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. He rarely spoke of his wife directly. She'd tell the boys they were small parts of a big story, but that every part mattered, that they should figure out what part they wanted to play, and then play it well. She sounds like she was very wise, Lillian said gently. She was, smarter than me by half, better educated, should have married someone who could give her the life she deserved. His voice carried old pain. But she chose me anyway, and I spent every day trying to be worth that choice. Pa, Owen said softly, you were worth it. You are worth it. Mama never regretted marrying you. How do you know? The question was plaintive, almost childlike. Because she told me the last time I talked to her before. She said choosing you was the best decision she ever made, that you gave her 3 beautiful sons and a life full of purpose. She said she'd choose you again, every time. Jonah's face worked with emotion, and Lillian saw him struggle to maintain composure in front of his children. She said that? She said that. Owen's voice was firm, certain. And she said to tell you, when the time was right, that loving you was never a sacrifice. It was a gift she gave herself. The silence that followed was thick with emotion too complex for words. Lillian found herself blinking back tears, moved by this moment of healing she had no right to witness, yet couldn't look away from. I wish I'd known, Jonah finally managed. I wish she'd told me herself. She tried, I think, but you were so busy taking care of her, taking care of us, that you didn't hear, and then she ran out of time. Owen swallowed hard. I was waiting for the right moment to tell you. I think maybe this is it. Jonah stood abruptly and pulled his oldest son into a fierce embrace, and then the other 2 boys were there too, and Lillian watched this family hold each other and let years of unspoken grief and love finally find expression. She slipped away to the parlor, giving them privacy, and busied herself organizing her fossil specimens by lamplight. The family sounds behind her, quiet voices, occasional laughter mixed with tears. The sense of ice breaking after a long freeze made her chest tight with emotions she didn't want to examine too closely. When Jonah finally came to find her, his eyes were red but clear, and he carried 2 cups of coffee. Boys are in bed, wore themselves out, emotions and snow and fossil hunting all in one day. He handed her a cup and sat in the chair opposite her. Thank you. For what? I did nothing. You gave Owen permission to be happy again, to talk about his mother without fear of making things worse. You showed all of them that grief and joy can exist together, that remembering doesn't have to hurt so much it paralyzes you. He looked down at his coffee. You've been here less than a week, and you've changed everything. The storm trapped me here. I had no choice. Maybe. He raised his eyes to meet hers. Or maybe the storm did what it needed to do, brought something this family desperately needed. even if we didn't know we needed it. The fire crackled, and outside the window stars blazed in the crystal-clear Wyoming sky. Inside, two lonely people sat across from each other and felt the weight of what was growing between them, something neither had anticipated, something that felt both dangerous and inevitable. "I'll need to begin my actual research soon," Lillian said, breaking the moment. "That's why I came here after all. The rocks won't study themselves." "No, I suppose they won't." Jonah's voice was neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Disappointment? Relief? She couldn't tell. "Weather should hold for a few days at least. You'll have time to do your work." "Yes, time to work." She set down her coffee cup. "I should retire. It's been a long day." "Lillian." Her name stopped her at the bottom of the stairs. "When you finish your research and head back to Boston, will you stay in touch? Write to the boys, maybe. They've gotten attached, and I'd hate for them to lose someone else they care about." It was carefully phrased, making it about the boys rather than himself. But Lillian heard what he wasn't saying, that he'd gotten attached too, that the thought of her leaving already hurt, even though they'd barely begun to know each other. "Of course I'll write," she said softly. "I promise." She climbed the stairs and prepared for bed, and tried not to think about how many promises were made with good intentions and broken by distance and time. Tried not to wonder what she was really promising, letters to 3 grieving boys, or something more dangerous. Something that felt like a thread connecting her heart to a Wyoming ranch and the broken family trying to heal there. Tomorrow she would begin her research. She would do the work she came here for, would collect fossils and take notes and fulfill her scientific obligations. She would remember why she was here, what her real life waited for back in Boston. But tonight, listening to the house settle around her, she let herself imagine what it might be like to stay, to belong somewhere, to choose connection over achievement, and find that the choice didn't diminish her but somehow made her more complete. In the room below, Jonah sat by the dying fire and held a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He thought about his wife's words, delivered by their son months after her death, that loving him had never been a sacrifice but a gift. He thought about the Eastern lady sleeping upstairs in Sarah's clothes, wearing Sarah's boots, bringing his house back to life with her passion for ancient stones and dead creatures. And he thought about how dangerous it was to let himself hope that lightning might strike twice, that a woman like Lillian Price might choose a life like his, might find something in this hard land worth staying for. Outside, an owl called across the frozen darkness, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath their ancient light. The next 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt almost like belonging. Lillian rose with the dawn, joined the family for Jonah's substantial breakfast, then spent her mornings in the field with her tools and notebooks while the boys did their chores and lessons. The weather held clear and bitterly cold, the kind of cold that made her lungs ache and her fingers clumsy even inside thick gloves. But she pushed through, driven by the excitement of discovery. The rock formations on the McCrae Ranch were even more promising than she'd hoped. She found layers of limestone rich with marine fossils, brachiopods, crinoid stems, coral fragments that spoke of warm, shallow seas. She photographed, sketched, cataloged, and filled page after page of her field notebooks with observations that would make her colleagues in Boston sit up and take notice. In the afternoons, she returned to the house half frozen and found the boys waiting with hot coffee and eager questions about what she'd found. They'd become her assistants of sorts, helping clean specimens, learning to use the magnifying glass, drawing careful pictures in their own notebooks that Lillian supplied from her extras. Even Jonah sometimes lingered at the kitchen table during these sessions, his weathered hands gentle as he examined a fossilized shell, his questions surprisingly insightful. "So this creature," he'd said one afternoon, holding up a brachiopod, "it lived and died millions of years ago, and now we're holding it like it's nothing special. Makes you think about what'll be left of us in a million years." "Probably very little," Lillian had admitted. "Most organisms leave no trace at all. We're only finding these because the conditions were exactly right for preservation. Most of life's story is lost forever. We're just reading the chapters that happened to survive." "Like memory," Owen had said quietly. "Some things get preserved and some things just disappear." The conversation had grown heavy after that, turning to what they remembered of Sarah and what had already begun to fade. Lillian had listened more than she spoke, learning about a woman who'd read poetry aloud, who'd taught the boys to identify birds by their songs, who'd insisted on piano lessons even though the nearest piano was in town and they had to practice on a keyboard drawn on the kitchen table. "She sounds remarkable," Lillian had said and meant it. She was. Jonah's voice had been soft. "We were lucky to have her as long as we did." But the ease between them was growing into something more complicated. Lillian caught Jonah watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between gratitude and longing and fear. When she handed him his coffee in the morning, their fingers would brush and both would pull away too quickly. When she laughed at something Micah said, she'd look up to find Jonah's face transformed by a smile that faded the moment he noticed her watching. They were dancing around something neither was willing to name, and the tension of it made the air between them feel charged like the atmosphere before a storm. In the evenings, after supper, and after the boys were in bed, Lillian worked at the kitchen table on her correspondence. She wrote long, detailed letters to Professor Williams at Harvard, to Dr. Chen, who ran the Natural History Museum in Boston, to colleagues at various universities describing her findings and requesting their thoughts on several unusual specimens. She wrote about the geological formations, the fossil assemblages, the implications for understanding ancient climate patterns in the region. And in those letters, written in the careful academic language required for professional correspondence, she described her stay at the McCrae Ranch in terms that were truthful but incomplete. She called it a necessary accommodation during inclement weather, referred to the family as gracious hosts, and characterized the entire experience as an interruption to the primary research, though not without its own anthropological interest. She didn't mention how Luke had started calling her our Dr. Lillian with unconscious possessiveness. She didn't describe the way Owen had begun sharing his private thoughts about wanting to see the world, or how Micah had started drawing elaborate pictures of the ancient seas that once covered his home. She certainly didn't write about the way her heart clenched every time Jonah smiled at her, or how she'd started thinking of the ranch house as home in the privacy of her own thoughts. Those truths were too dangerous to commit to paper, too likely to reveal how much she'd let herself care about 3 boys and their broken father. So she wrote the safe version, the professional version, the story that would make sense to people who lived in a world of lecture halls and academic politics. She was sealing one such letter on a bright December morning, 2 days before Christmas, when Jonah came in from the barn earlier than expected. She looked up with a smile that faded when she saw his expression. "Is something wrong? Are the boys all right?" "They're fine. Working on their surprise for you." His voice was stiff, formal. "I need to ride into town for supplies before the next storm hits, probably be gone most of the day." "Oh, of course. Do you need help with anything before you go?" "No, Miss Price. I think you've done quite enough already." The way he said Miss Price, after weeks of Lillian, hit her like a slap. "Jonah, what?" But he was already gone, the door closing behind him with careful control that was somehow worse than if he'd slammed it. Through the window, she watched him harness the wagon with jerky, angry movements, then drive off without looking back at the house. Lillian sat frozen at the table, her sealed letter in her hand, trying to understand what had just happened. What had she done? What had changed between last night's easy conversation by the fire and this morning's cold formality? Owen appeared in the doorway, his young face troubled. "Dr. Price? Pa seemed upset. Did you two have a fight?" "I don't think so. I'm not sure what happened." She set down her letter and tried to smile reassuringly. "Perhaps he's just worried about the weather." "You said another storm is coming?" "Always another storm coming." Owen moved into the kitchen, older than his years as always. "But Pa doesn't usually get like that about weather. He only gets that quiet and angry when he's hurt about something." Hurt. The word settled in Lillian's stomach like a stone. What could have hurt him? She ran through their last several conversations, searching for something she'd said or done that might have caused offense but came up empty. The day passed with uncomfortable slowness. The boys worked on their mysterious Christmas project in the barn, something they insisted was a surprise and she wasn't allowed to see. Lillian tried to lose herself in her field notes, but found her attention wandering to the empty chair at the table where Jonah usually sat with his leather working or his account books. his quiet presence a comfort she hadn't realized she'd been depending on. When he returned near sunset, his wagon loaded with supplies, he barely acknowledged her greeting. The boys rushed to help unload, and Lillian caught fragments of their excited chatter about Christmas preparations, but Jonah's responses were monosyllabic, distracted. At supper he was polite but distant, calling her Miss Price and ma'am with painful formality. After the meal he retreated immediately to his room, claiming exhaustion from the long cold ride. The boys looked between Lillian and the closed door with obvious confusion, and she had no answers to offer them. "Did we do something wrong?" Luke asked in a small voice. "Is Pa mad at us?" "No, sweetheart. I don't think this has anything to do with you." But even as she said it, Lillian wondered. Maybe Jonah had realized how attached his sons were becoming to her and decided to protect them from the inevitable hurt of her departure. Maybe he was pulling away now to make her leaving easier. The thought should have been comforting, evidence that Jonah was a good father, thinking of his children's well-being. Instead, it made her chest ache with a loss she had no right to feel. She spent another sleepless night staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind pick up outside. Another storm was indeed coming, and this one felt like a metaphor for whatever had broken between her and Jonah. When she finally slept, she dreamed of frozen landscapes and voices calling from too far away to answer. The next day, Christmas Eve, was tense and strange. The boys were bubbling with barely contained excitement about both Christmas and their secret project, but their father's withdrawn mood dampened their spirits. They kept looking between the adults, trying to understand the sudden cold current running through the house. Lillian threw herself into helping with Christmas preparations, anything to stay busy and useful. She helped Micah string popcorn garland, assisted Luke in drawing Christmas pictures to hang on the walls, and listened to Owen practice the poem he wanted to recite for the holiday. They'd killed and plucked one of the chickens for Christmas dinner, and she forced herself to learn how to prepare it properly, determined not to produce another disaster like her bread. Jonah worked outside most of the day, finding endless tasks that kept him away from the house. When he did come in, he was unfailingly polite and utterly unreachable, his walls rebuilt higher than they'd been when she first arrived. That evening, they sat down to a quiet supper that felt more like a funeral than a celebration. The boys had made paper decorations, and a small pine tree stood in the corner of the parlor decorated with their popcorn garlands and paper stars, but the joy had leaked out of the house like heat through cracks. "Tomorrow's Christmas," Luke said into the silence, his voice uncertain. "We're supposed to be happy." "We are happy," Jonah said automatically. Then, seeing his son's doubtful face, he softened. "I'm sorry, boys. I've been poor company. That's not your fault, and it's not fair to you. Tomorrow will be better. I promise." "Is Dr. Price staying for Christmas?" Micah asked carefully. "She is, isn't she?" Lillian saw Jonah's jaw tighten before he answered. "Of course. Dr. Price is our guest, and she's welcome to spend the holiday with us." Guest. The word created distance where days ago there had been something warmer, something that felt almost like family. Lillian forced a smile. "I'd be honored to spend Christmas with you. Thank you for including me." The formality of it made Owen frown, but he didn't comment. After supper, the boys disappeared to the barn one last time to complete their surprise, and Lillian found herself alone in the kitchen with Jonah for the first time since his mood had shifted. She decided to be direct. "Jonah, please tell me what I've done wrong. This coldness between us, I don't understand where it came from. If I've offended you somehow—" "You haven't offended me, Miss Price." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "I've simply remembered my place and yours. You're here for research. I'm providing accommodation as agreed. Let's not pretend it's more complicated than that." "But it is more complicated." She moved closer, needing him to look at her. "These past weeks were pleasant, educational for the boys, but temporary." Finally, he met her gaze, and what she saw there was worse than anger. It was resignation, the look of someone who'd already accepted loss. "You'll finish your research and go back to your real life in Boston. That's how it should be. I was a fool to forget that, even for a moment. Jonah, I found your letters." The words came out flat. "Yesterday morning, before you came down. They were on the table and one had come unsealed. I wasn't trying to read your private correspondence, but I saw enough enough to understand how you really see this place, this interruption to your real work, these gracious hosts who are providing anthropological interest. Horror washed through Lillian like ice water. You read my letters to Professor Williams? I read one paragraph of one letter. That was sufficient. He turned away, his shoulders rigid. You described this exactly as it is, a delay caused by weather, nothing more. And you were right to do so. I'm the one who made the mistake of thinking it meant something beyond that. Those letters were written for academic colleagues who wouldn't understand. Wouldn't understand what? The truth? That you're a scientist doing research, and we're just the people who happen to own the land you're studying? His voice was getting rougher, emotion breaking through. You wrote the truth, Lillian. Don't apologize for it. I'm the one who needs to apologize for letting my sons get attached to someone who was always planning to leave. I never lied to any of you about my plans. No, you didn't. You were honest from the start. I'm the one who lied, to myself, mostly, letting myself believe that maybe... He stopped, shook his head. It doesn't matter what I let myself believe. You have your life in Boston, your real work, your colleagues, and your career. We're just a detour, and there's no shame in that. But I need to protect my boys from getting hurt worse than they already have been. So I'm asking you, when you leave after Christmas, make it clean. Don't promise to write. Don't make them think you'll come back. Just go. And let us get back to the life we had before the storm trapped you here. Each word landed like a blow, and Lillian found herself struggling to breathe. Is that really what you want? What I want doesn't matter. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. What matters is keeping my sons safe. They've lost too much already. I won't let them lose someone else they've come to love. And what about you? The question escaped before she could stop it. Have you come to care for me? Even a little? The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with honesty. Yes. God help me. Yes. Which is why you need to leave, Lillian, because I can't, I won't, ask you to give up your life's work for a broke widower and his 3 boys on a hardscrabble ranch in the middle of nowhere. Sarah did that, and she died regretting it. I won't do that to another woman. He stopped himself. I won't do that to you. Lillian's throat was tight with unshed tears. Those letters, they were written in the language my colleagues understand, but they weren't the whole truth. They weren't... It's late. We should both get some rest. Tomorrow's Christmas, and the boys deserve better than watching 2 adults dance around uncomfortable truths. He moved toward his room, then paused. For what it's worth, you've been good for them. Good for this house. I'm grateful for that, even if the ending is going to hurt. He disappeared into his room before she could respond, and Lillian stood alone in the kitchen with tears finally spilling down her cheeks. She'd been so careful to protect her professional reputation, to maintain the proper distance in her letters, to not reveal how deeply she'd become entangled with this family. And in doing so, she'd hurt the one person she'd never wanted to hurt. She climbed the stairs with leaden feet and lay awake most of the night, listening to the wind rise and snow begin to fall again. Another storm, just as Jonah had predicted. Would this one trap her here longer? Or would the roads clear just enough for her to make her escape before she caused more damage to hearts that had already been broken once? Christmas morning dawned gray and cold, with fresh snow layering the world in white. Lillian dressed carefully and went downstairs to find the boys already up, vibrating with excitement despite the tension they couldn't quite understand. They'd laid out small packages wrapped in brown paper and string, and their faces glowed with anticipation. "Merry Christmas, Dr. Price!" Luke rushed to hug her waist, and Lillian felt her heart crack a little more. How could she leave this? How could she walk away from 3 boys who looked at her like she mattered? "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." She smoothed his hair and tried to smile. Jonah emerged from his room, and for just a moment their eyes met. She saw exhaustion there that matched her own, and pain that went deep. Then he looked away and focused on his sons. "Merry Christmas, boys. Shall we have breakfast first, or presents?" "Presents!" they chorused. They gathered in the parlor around the small decorated tree, and the boys presented their gifts with shy pride. For Jonah, they'd made a new leather bookmark with his initials carefully tooled into it, Owen's work, precise. and careful. For each other, they'd exchange small treasures, an interesting rock, a carved wooden whistle, a picture drawn with painstaking detail. And for Lillian, they'd created something that made her throat close with emotion. It was a wooden box, carefully constructed and sanded smooth. Inside, cushioned with cotton, were the 3 fossils they'd found together on their first hunt: Micah's fern, Owen's ripple rock, Luke's mystery fossils. And tucked beneath them was a letter, written in Owen's careful script. "Dear Dr. Price," it read, "these fossils belong together because we found them together. They're from our land, but they're part of your work too. We wanted you to have them so you remember us when you go back to Boston. Thank you for teaching us about ancient seas and deep time. Thank you for making our house feel alive again. Thank you for not treating us like we're too young to understand important things. We'll never forget you. Love, Owen, Micah, and Luke McCrae." Lillian's hands shook as she read, tears blurring the words. When she looked up, 3 anxious faces watched her, waiting to see if they'd done right. "This is the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given me," she managed. "I will treasure it always. Thank you." "You're crying," Luke said, concerned. "Did we make you sad?" "No, sweetheart. Sometimes we cry when we're happy too. These are happy tears." But they weren't. Not entirely. They were tears for what was being lost, for the family she'd briefly let herself imagine being part of, for the life she'd glimpsed and would have to walk away from. Jonah had been watching this exchange with an expression that suggested he was being physically hurt. Now he cleared his throat roughly. "Boys, why don't you give Dr. Price and me a moment alone? Go check on the Christmas chicken, make sure it's thawing properly." They went reluctantly, casting worried looks over their shoulders. When they were gone, Jonah moved to stand by the window, looking out at the falling snow. "They made that box weeks ago," he said quietly. "Been working on it every spare moment, trying to make it perfect for you. They love you, Lillian, and I can't watch them lose someone else. I can't watch their faces when you leave. I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to become so important to them. I know, it's not your fault. They were starving for someone who saw them as people instead of responsibilities, someone who brought wonder back into their lives. You gave them that. How could they not love you for it?" Lillian stood and moved to face him, though he still wouldn't look at her. "Jonah, those letters you read are the truth about your real life, and that's fine. That's as it should be." His jaw clenched. "But my sons don't understand the difference between someone who cares about them and someone who's staying. They've already been practicing what they'll say in letters to you, planning things they want to show you when you visit again. They don't understand that visit again probably means never. You think I'm that cruel? That I'd abandon them completely? I think you're human. I think you'll go back to Boston with good intentions, and you'll write a few letters, and then your real life will take over, and the letters will get farther apart and eventually stop. And my boys will check the mail every day hoping for word from you, and eventually they'll stop hoping, and that's going to break their hearts all over again." His voice cracked. "So I'm asking you, please don't make promises you can't keep. Don't give them hope that's just going to turn into another loss." Before Lillian could respond, the boys returned, their earlier excitement dampened by adult tension they couldn't quite grasp. "Is everything all right?" Owen asked carefully. "Everything's fine," Jonah lied. "Dr. Price was just showing me her wonderful gift. You boys did excellent work." They spent the rest of Christmas morning going through the motions of celebration. They ate a breakfast that Lillian barely tasted. They sang carols in voices that held more duty than joy. Jonah read the Christmas story from the Bible with his deep voice steady, despite the pain in his eyes. And through it all, Lillian felt the walls closing in, felt the weight of impending loss pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. After lunch, the chicken had turned out well, at least one thing hadn't been ruined. Luke climbed into Lillian's lap with the unconscious trust of a child who'd been allowed to love freely. He rested his head against her shoulder and sighed with contentment. "This is the best Christmas since Mama died," he said simply. "Because you're here." Micah nodded agreement. "It feels like family again, like we're whole." Owen didn't speak, but his eyes said everything his voice couldn't. These boys had opened their hearts to her, had let her in past their grief and their fear, and now she was going to leave them, just like their mother had left them, even though death wasn't the same as choice, even though one was tragedy and the other was just life. Jonah stood abruptly. Boys, I need to check the barn before the snow gets worse. Owen, you're with me. But Pa, it's Christmas. Cattle don't care about Christmas. Get your gear. Father and son bundled up and headed out, and Lillian was left with Micah and Luke, who were looking at her with dawning comprehension that something was very wrong. You're leaving soon, aren't you? Micah's voice was small. That's why Pa's been so sad. My research is nearly complete. I'll need to return to Boston before too long. When? Luke's grip on her hand tightened painfully. When are you leaving? I'm not sure yet. It depends on the weather, and when I can get passage on the train. Don't go! The words burst from Luke with desperate intensity. Please don't go. Stay here with us. We need you. Luke, I have responsibilities in Boston, my work, my colleagues. But you have us here. Tears were streaming down his face now. We love you. Doesn't that matter more than rocks and dead things? Micah had gone pale. You're leaving just like Mama did. You're going to go away and not come back. That's not... Micah, I'm not dying. I'm just going home. This could be your home. Luke was sobbing now, clutching at her with desperate hands. You make Pa happy. You make all of us happy. Why isn't that enough? Why are we never enough to make people stay? The door opened and Jonah and Owen returned, stopping short at the scene before them. Luke was wrapped around Lillian like she was the only thing keeping him from drowning, his small body shaking with sobs. Micah had tears running silently down his face, and Lillian sat frozen, her own tears falling, unable to offer comfort, when she was the source of their pain. Boys, Jonah started, but Owen cut him off. We made her that box so she'd remember us, the 11-year-old said, his voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. We wanted her to have pieces of our land, our home, so she'd always have a reason to think about us. But really, we were hoping if she had pieces of us, she might want to stay for the whole thing, for all of us. Owen, that's not fair to Dr. Price, Jonah tried again. Nothing's fair. Owen's voice broke. Nothing's been fair since Mama died. And we finally have someone who makes things better, who makes us feel like we might be happy again someday, and she's leaving too. Everyone leaves. Everyone we love goes away. Luke's sobs had reached a pitch of grief that bordered on hysterical, and Micah had begun crying too, months of held-back emotion finally breaking through. They clustered around Lillian, holding onto her skirts, her hands, her arms, as if physical grip could keep her anchored to them. Please, Luke kept repeating between sobs. Please don't leave like Mama did. Please stay, please. Please, Micah echoed, his face buried against her shoulder. We'll be good. We'll help with your research. We'll be so good if you just stay. Please, Owen whispered, his young voice breaking on the word. We love you. Isn't that worth something? And Jonah, standing in the doorway with his own face wet with tears, watching his son's hearts break all over again, added just one word that carried the weight of everything he'd been holding back. Please. It was barely audible, nearly lost under the sound of his son's weeping, but Lillian heard it. Heard all the longing, all the fear, all the desperate hope he'd tried so hard to suppress. Heard the man beneath the walls, the heart beneath the grief, asking for something he had no right to ask for, but couldn't help needing anyway. The snow fell harder outside, the wind picking up, another storm settling in to trap them all together while they sorted through the wreckage of hearts that had dared to hope for something impossible. And Lillian sat at the center of it all, holding 3 sobbing boys and meeting the eyes of their father across the room, and knew that whatever choice she made next would change all of their lives forever. The room seemed to hold its breath, suspended in that moment of raw emotion. 3 boys clung to Lillian like she was the only solid thing in a world that had proven treacherous, their tears soaking into her dress, their small hands gripping her with desperate strength. Across the room, Jonah stood with his own face wet, that single word please still hanging in the air between them like a prayer. Lillian felt something crack open inside her chest, some carefully constructed wall she'd built between duty and desire, between what she thought she should want and what her heart was screaming for. She looked at these four people who'd become her family without her permission, without her planning, and felt the full weight of what walking away would mean. "Boys," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Boys, look at me." Slowly they lifted their tear-stained faces. Luke's eyes were swollen from crying, Micah's cheeks were flushed red, and Owen's jaw was clenched with the effort of trying to be brave. They looked at her with such naked hope and fear that Lillian felt her own tears fall faster. "I need you to understand something very important," she continued, choosing her words with care. "When I wrote those letters to my colleagues, I was trying to protect myself. I was scared of admitting how much you all meant to me, because that would make leaving hurt more. I described this as an interruption because that's what it was supposed to be. A delay, nothing more. But that's not what it became." "What did it become?" Owen asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It became everything I didn't know I needed." Lillian reached up to wipe tears from Luke's face with trembling fingers. "You three, you reminded me that knowledge isn't just found in books and fossils. It's found in connection, in family, in learning to love people who need you as much as you need them. And your father—" She looked across the room at Jonah, who stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. "Your father showed me that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about breaking and still finding the courage to put yourself back together, to keep going, to keep loving even when loss feels inevitable." "So you'll stay?" Luke's voice was so small, so fragile with hope. Lillian opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. Because the truth was, she didn't know. The responsible part of her, the part that had fought so hard to be taken seriously in a man's world, was screaming that she couldn't just abandon her career, her reputation, her entire life for a family she'd known less than a month. What would her colleagues say? Her father? What would become of her research, her aspirations, her carefully constructed plans? But then she looked at these boys, these brave, broken boys who dared to love her despite knowing loss. And she thought about what she'd told Luke days ago, that being scared doesn't mean you're doing the wrong thing, it just means you're doing something that matters enough to be frightening. "I don't know," she said honestly, and felt the boy's grips tighten with fear. "I need time to think. This is not a small decision. It would change everything about my life. I need you to understand that." "How much time?" Micah asked. "I don't know that either." She looked at Jonah, needing him to understand. "I'm not saying no, but I'm not saying yes yet either. This is too important to decide in a moment of high emotion. I need to think clearly." Jonah nodded slowly, his face carefully neutral now, walls rebuilding. "Boys, let Dr. Price have some space. She's right, this is a big decision, and we shouldn't pressure her." "But Pa," Luke started. "No." Jonah's voice was gentle but firm. "We've said our piece. Now we let her think. Come on, there are evening chores to do, storm or no storm." The boys released Lillian reluctantly, and she felt the loss of their warmth like a physical ache. They followed their father out, Luke casting one last pleading look over his shoulder that nearly broke her resolve to think rationally. Alone in the parlor, Lillian wrapped her arms around herself and tried to sort through the chaos of her thoughts. On one hand, there was her life in Boston, the university connections, the museum access, the opportunity to publish research that could establish her reputation. It was everything she'd worked for, everything she'd defied her father and society to achieve. Walking away from it felt like betraying not just herself, but every woman who'd fought for the right to pursue knowledge. On the other hand, there was this. A ranch in Wyoming, a widower with 3 sons, a life that would be hard and often lonely, far from the intellectual community she'd always thought she needed, but also a life with purpose beyond publication, with love that was freely given, with the chance to shape young minds and build something real with her hands and heart instead of just studying what had been built by time and pressure millions of years ago. She moved to the window and stared out at the falling snow. The storm was intensifying, white erasing the landscape until nothing existed beyond the walls of this house. Trapped again, she thought. But was she really? Or had she been trapped all along in Boston, in expectations and ambitions that belonged more to what she thought she should want than what she actually needed? Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, Words spoken years ago when Lillian had announced her intention to pursue university education. The world will tell you what you should be, but only you can decide what you will be. Make sure the choice is yours, Lillian, not theirs. Was this her choice? Or was she just responding to emotional manipulation from desperate people? She didn't think the boys or Jonah were being manipulative intentionally. Their pain was too raw, too real. But that didn't mean she should make a life-altering decision based on their tears. She needed to think about this logically, practically. What would staying actually mean? She'd need to find a way to continue her research from here. There was certainly geological interest in the region, and she could potentially publish from Wyoming as well as from Boston. She'd need to figure out her relationship with Jonah. Were they talking about marriage, partnership? And what about the boys? Would she be taking on the role of mother to children who still grieved their real mother? The door opened quietly, and Jonah slipped back inside, snow dusting his shoulders. He'd clearly just come from checking the animals again, his face red from cold, his eyes still carrying the weight of earlier emotion. "I sent the boys to their rooms," he said quietly. "Told them to read or rest. They need some time to calm down." "Thank you." Lillian turned from the window to face him. "Jonah, we need to talk. Really talk, without the boys, without emotion overwhelming everything." He nodded and moved to stoke the fire, giving himself something to do with his hands. "I owe you an apology. We had no right to put that kind of pressure on you. The boys are children and don't understand what they were asking. But I'm a grown man, and I should have known better. You asked me to stay. Do you really want that? Or do you just want someone to help raise your sons and ease your loneliness?" The bluntness of the question made him flinch, but he didn't look away. "That's fair, you deserve honesty." He sank into the chair opposite her, his long frame folding with weariness. "When Sarah died, I thought I was done. Done loving, done hoping, done with anything beyond just surviving day to day and making sure the boys survived too. I built walls so high I couldn't see over them myself. And then a storm brought you here, and you climbed those walls like they were nothing, and suddenly I could breathe again." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, his calloused hands clasped between them. "Do I want help raising my sons? Yes, they need a mother's influence, and they've clearly chosen you for that role. Do I want ease for my loneliness? God, yes. This house has been so quiet, so empty, and you filled it with life and laughter and purpose. But Lillian, that's not why I want you to stay." "Then why?" "Because I love you." The words came out raw, unpolished. "I know it's too soon. I know it's not logical. I know 100 reasons why I shouldn't, but I do. I love your fierce intelligence and your terrible cooking. I love the way you talk to my boys like they matter, like their thoughts and questions are worth taking seriously. I love how you're not intimidated by this land or this life or me. I love that you refuse to make yourself smaller for anyone's comfort. And I love the person I am when I'm with you, someone who can hope again, who can imagine a future that isn't just endurance." Lillian felt tears tracking down her face again. "I could love you too. I think I already do, though it terrifies me to admit it. But Jonah, love isn't enough. It wasn't enough for Sarah. Don't." His voice was sharp, then softened. "Sorry, but please don't assume you know what Sarah felt or wanted based on fever dreams and my own insecurities. Owen told me she chose me and never regretted it. I need to believe that. And I need to trust that if you choose this, you're doing it with clear eyes, knowing exactly what you're trading and why. That's just it. I'm not sure I do know what I'm trading. My career, possibly. My reputation, certainly. The respect of my colleagues. My father will be apoplectic. The university will consider me another cautionary tale about women lacking the dedication for serious scientific work. And what do you gain? A family, a home, love, purpose that's measured in people rather than publications." She met his eyes. "But Jonah, I need you to understand, I can't give up geology entirely. It's not just what I do, it's part of who I am. If I stay, I need to keep working, keep researching. Maybe not at the pace I would have in Boston, maybe not with the same resources, but I can't just become a ranch wife and abandon everything I've worked for. I would never ask you to." He stood and moved to kneel in front of her chair, taking her hands in his work-roughened ones. "Lillian, I don't want you to be anyone other than who you are. This ranch has dozens of sites worth studying. The whole territory has formations that haven't been properly examined. You could do groundbreaking work right here, publish it, share it with the world, and you'd be doing it on your own terms, without university politics or professors telling you women can't understand science. It would be lonely, isolated, no colleagues to consult with, no laboratories, no libraries. You could travel sometimes, take trips to consult with colleagues, present research. The boys and I, we'd understand. We wouldn't expect you to be here every moment. His grip on her hands tightened. I'm not asking you to sacrifice your work for us. I'm asking you to build a life that includes both, your research and our family. It won't be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is. Lillian looked down at their joined hands, hers smaller and soft despite the cold, his large and scarred from years of hard labor. Such different hands, such different lives, and yet they fit together with surprising rightness. "What about the boys?" she asked quietly. "They're grieving their mother. I can't replace her." "No one expects you to. Sarah will always be their mother, and they'll always love her. But Luke is 6 years old, Lillian. He needs a mother in his life now, not just a memory. Micah needs guidance as he grows. And Owen needs an example of a woman who's strong and accomplished, so he doesn't grow up thinking women are weak or limited. You can't replace Sarah, but you can give them something they desperately need, a future that includes maternal love. And if I can't love them the way a mother should, if I fail them, you already love them. I see it every time you look at them, every time you patiently answer Micah's 100th question or help Luke with his letters or listen to Owen's dreams. You love them, and they know it. That's all they need, someone who shows up, who stays, who loves them even when it's hard. The fire crackled, and somewhere overhead a board creaked as one of the boys moved in his room. The storm howled outside, and inside this small circle of warmth and light, two broken people held onto each other and tried to believe that wholeness was possible. "I'm afraid," Lillian whispered. "I'm terrified I'll make the wrong choice, that I'll stay and regret it, or leave and regret that I'll fail you or the boys or myself, that I'll lose everything I've worked for and have nothing to show for it, but a life that might not even work. I'm afraid too." Jonah's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "I'm afraid you'll leave and take all the light with you. I'm afraid you'll stay and realize you made a mistake, and I'll watch you grow resentful and trapped. I'm afraid to love you and lose you. Afraid to love you and keep you. But Lillian, fear is just another thing we'll have to live with. The question is whether we live with it together or apart." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the grieving widower or the struggling rancher, but the man underneath, strong and gentle, broken and healing, flawed and doing his best. A man who'd lost everything and still found the courage to risk his heart again. And she thought about what she'd told the boys about fossils, that they were messages from a world so distant it might as well be another planet, voices from ancient lives preserved in stone. Her whole career had been about listening to those dead voices, giving them meaning, making them matter to the present. But here were living voices, present voices, saying, "We need you, we love you, please stay." When had she started caring more about the dead than the living? "I need to go upstairs," she said finally. "I need to be alone and really think this through. Can you give me until tomorrow morning?" Disappointment flashed across Jonah's face, but he nodded and released her hands. "Of course. Take all the time you need. The storm's not going anywhere. You're not leaving tonight regardless." She stood and moved toward the stairs, then paused and turned back. "Jonah? Whatever I decide, thank you for loving me. Thank you for seeing me as both a scientist and a woman, for not making me choose between them. That means more than you know." "Whatever you decide," he echoed, his voice rough. "You should know that you've already given us something precious. You reminded us how to hope, how to feel joy again. Even if you leave, we'll carry that with us. You'll have mattered, Lillian, to all of us." She fled upstairs before she could break down completely, shutting herself in her room and leaning against the door. Her packed cases sat in the corner where she'd left them days ago, ready for departure that kept getting delayed by weather and circumstance, or maybe by her own subconscious reluctance to leave. She moved to the window and watched the snow fall in the darkness, thick flakes catching the lamplight from downstairs. The landscape beyond was invisible, erased by winter, and she thought about how appropriate that was. Her old life in Boston felt equally erased now, distant and unreal compared to the vivid immediacy of this house, this family, this unexpected love. What did she really want? Strip away expectations and fear and practicality. What did her heart actually desire? She wanted to wake up in this house with morning light streaming through frosted windows. She wanted to drink coffee with Jonah while planning the day's work, his with cattle and fences, hers with rocks and research. She wanted to teach the boys about science and history and the wide world beyond Wyoming, then watch them teach her about survival and resilience and finding joy in simple things. She wanted to build a life where mind and heart weren't competitors but partners, where she could be Dr. Lillian Price, the geologist, and simply Lillian, the woman who loved these four males with all her flawed, fierce heart. She wanted this, all of it, despite the cost, despite the risk, despite every logical reason to walk away. But could she forgive herself if she stayed? Could she live with giving up the academic career she'd fought so hard for? Could she face her father's disappointment, her colleagues' dismissal, the knowledge that she'd proven every skeptic right by choosing marriage and family over scholarship? The answer came to her with sudden clarity. Yes, she could live with all of that because she'd be making the choice for herself, not for them. The women who'd fought for education rights, who demanded access to universities and laboratories and intellectual life, they'd fought for choice. Not the obligation to always choose career over family, but the freedom to choose what made each individual woman whole and happy. Some women found wholeness in laboratories and lecture halls. Some found it in homes and family. And some, like her, found that wholeness required both, woven together in ways that defied easy categorization. She could be a scientist in Wyoming. She could publish research from a ranch house and correspond with colleagues by mail and maybe even establish herself as an expert on Western geological formations. The work would be different, harder in some ways, but potentially more authentic, doing field research because she loved it, not to prove herself to people who'd never truly accept her anyway. And she could be a mother to 3 boys who needed her, a wife to a man who loved her, a woman who chose connection over recognition and found that the choice didn't diminish her but made her larger, more complete. The decision settled into her bones with quiet certainty. She was staying. But even as relief flooded through her, anxiety followed. How would she tell her father? How would she explain this to her colleagues? What would she do about her apartment in Boston, her belongings, her academic connections? The logistics suddenly seemed overwhelming. She'd figure it out. She'd write letters, make arrangements, deal with the practical realities. But first she needed to tell 4 people downstairs that they didn't have to be afraid anymore. That she was choosing them, choosing this, choosing a future that was uncertain and difficult, and absolutely right. She splashed cold water on her face, tidied her hair, and took a deep breath. Then she opened her door and found 3 boys sitting in the hallway outside, clearly having crept up to be closer to her while they waited for her decision. "We couldn't sleep," Owen said defensively, as if he expected to be sent away. "We needed to know," Micah added. Luke just held out his arms, and Lillian gathered him close, kneeling on the floor to be at eye level with all 3. "I've made my decision," she said quietly. 3 faces looked at her with such naked hope and fear that her heart clenched. This was why she was staying, for these 3 brave souls who'd dared to love her despite knowing loss, who'd opened their wounded hearts and risked more pain for the chance of joy. "My research can wait," she said, and watched their eyes widen. "It's important, yes, but it's not everything. Love can't wait. Love doesn't defer to more convenient timing or better circumstances. Love happens now, or it doesn't happen at all." "You're staying?" Luke breathed, almost afraid to believe. "I'm staying. If you'll have me. If your father will have me. I'm choosing you 3 and your father, choosing this family, choosing this life we could build together." The hallway erupted in chaos as 3 boys threw themselves at her, knocking her backwards, wrapping her in arms and love and jubilant tears. They were laughing and crying simultaneously, talking over each other, asking if she meant it, really truly meant it. She wouldn't change her mind. "I really truly mean it," Lillian promised, holding them close and crying herself. "I'm not going anywhere. This is home now. You're my family now." "Boys?" Jonah's voice came from the bottom of the stairs, worried. "What's all the noise?" He stopped when he reached the hallway and saw them all tangled together, tear-stained and smiling. His eyes found Lillian's over his son's heads, and she saw his face transform as he understood what her answer must have been. "I'm staying," she said again, "just for him. If you'll have me. All of you." He didn't speak, couldn't speak. He just opened his arms, and suddenly they were all together, 4 McCrae males and 1 Eastern lady who'd found her way home in the last place she'd expected. They held each other in the upstairs hallway while the storm raged outside, and for the first time since Sarah's death, the house felt truly whole. Eventually, the emotional storm subsided enough for practical matters. Jonah herded the boys back to their rooms with promises that everything would be discussed properly in the morning. At their doorways, each boy hugged Lillian goodnight, like she might disappear if they didn't physically confirm her presence. "You promise?" Luke asked for the dozenth time. "You absolutely promise you're staying?" "I absolutely promise. Now sleep, sweetheart. We'll talk more tomorrow." When the boys were finally settled, Jonah walked Lillian to her own door. They stood in the dim hallway, suddenly awkward now that the immediate crisis had passed. "I have things in Boston," Lillian said, needing to address practicalities before emotion overwhelmed her again. "An apartment, belongings, professional obligations. I'll need to go back and settle matters, probably in the spring when travel is easier." "Of course. We'll figure it out together. And I'll need to write letters, to my father, to colleagues. Some of those conversations will be difficult. I'll support you however you need." He reached out tentatively, and she took his hand, letting their fingers intertwine. "Lillian, I need you to know this doesn't have to mean marriage right away. We can take time, let you settle in, make sure this is really what you want." "I know what I want." She looked up at him, this good man who'd been through so much and still found the courage to love again. "But you're right that we should take some time. The boys need to adjust, I need to adjust, and we need to figure out what this relationship actually is before we formalize it. But Jonah, I am choosing this, choosing you. That's not going to change." He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the gesture courtly and tender. "Thank you for trusting us, for taking this leap. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it. And I'll spend mine making sure you remember that I chose this freely, that loving you and the boys isn't a sacrifice, but a gift I'm giving myself." They said goodnight reluctantly, neither wanting to part, but both exhausted from the emotional intensity of the day. Lillian closed her door and leaned against it, feeling simultaneously drained and energized. She'd done it. She'd made the choice that would change everything, and instead of regret, all she felt was rightness. She unpacked her cases, hanging her clothes properly, arranging her belongings as someone who was staying, not just visiting. The room felt different now, not a temporary accommodation, but her space in her home. She placed the wooden box the boys had made on the small table by the window, where lamplight would catch the fossils inside and remind her of the day they'd all hunted treasure together. Sleep came surprisingly easy, and for the first time since arriving at the McCrae Ranch, Lillian's dreams weren't anxious tangles of obligations and expectations. Instead, she dreamed of spring arriving, of teaching the boys to identify birds by their songs like Sarah had done, of sitting on the porch with Jonah and watching sunset paint the mountains gold. She dreamed of a future that was real and reachable, no longer a frightening unknown, but a promise waiting to be fulfilled. She woke to Christmas morning light, the second Christmas morning she realized, though yesterday felt like it had happened years ago, and the smell of coffee and breakfast cooking. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find the whole family already gathered in the kitchen, the boys practically vibrating with barely contained excitement. "Good morning," she said, and was immediately engulfed in hugs from 3 boys who apparently needed to physically confirm she was still there. "It wasn't a dream," Luke said with relief. "You're really staying." "I'm really staying." She accepted coffee from Jonah, whose eyes held warmth and something deeper, gratitude, love, hope, all mixed together. They ate breakfast together, and the conversation flowed with an ease that had been missing yesterday. The boys wanted to talk about everything at once. When would Dr. Price move her things permanently into the house? Could she help them with more fossil hunting? Would she teach them to draw scientific diagrams like in her notebooks? Could they call her something other than Dr. Price now? "What would you like to call me?" Lillian asked, touched by the question. The boys looked at each other, then at their father, suddenly uncertain. Owen spoke carefully. "We want to respect Mama's memory. We'll always call her Mama because she was our mother. But you're going to be our mother too, in a different way. We thought maybe we could call you Miss Lillian, like we have been, but knowing now that you're staying and it means something more?" "Miss Lillian sounds perfect." Lillian's throat was tight with emotion. "And you're right to honor your mother's memory. She'll always be your mama, and I would never want to take that from her or from you. I'm the one who gets to love you going forward, the one who'll be here as you grow up. Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense," Micah said firmly. "Mama gave us life and love, and then she had to go. You're giving us life and love now. We're lucky to have had both of you." After breakfast, while the boys did their morning chores, Lillian helped Jonah with dishes, and they talked about practical matters that needed addressing. "I'll need to write to Professor Williams and the university board explaining my decision to remain in Wyoming," she said, scrubbing a plate with more force than necessary. "They won't be pleased." "Will they try to prevent you from publishing your research?" "They can't prevent it, but they can make it difficult. Without university affiliation, I'll have a harder time getting published in major journals. But there are still options: smaller publications, direct submission to geological societies, even self-publishing if necessary." "What about your father?" Lillian set down the plate and stared out the window at the snow-covered landscape. "My father will see this as the ultimate proof that I wasn't serious about my education, that I was just playing at being a scholar until I found a husband. It will confirm every doubt he ever had about women in academia." "Will that bother you? His disappointment?" "Yes, but not enough to change my mind." She turned to face Jonah. "I've spent my whole adult life trying to prove I was serious enough, dedicated enough, smart enough to deserve respect in a field dominated by men. And I've realized something. I'll never be enough for people who've already decided I don't belong. So I might as well live the life that makes me happy rather than the life that might possibly earn their approval." Jonah pulled her into his arms, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat. "You're enough for us. More than enough. You're everything. And you're everything I didn't know I was missing." She pulled back to look up at him. "Jonah, I need you to understand. There will be days I miss academic life, days I feel frustrated by the isolation or the limited resources, days I wonder if I made the right choice. I know. And when those days come, we'll talk about them. We'll figure out solutions, maybe trips to visit colleagues, or bringing in supplies and equipment, or finding ways to stay connected to the scientific community. You're not giving up your work, Lillian. You're just relocating it. Relocating it to one of the most geologically interesting regions in North America," she added with a small smile. "There's enough work here to keep me busy for decades." "Then we're agreed. You stay, you work, you love us, and we support you in all of it." "Agreed." He kissed her then, gentle and tentative, and Lillian kissed him back with all the certainty she felt. This was right. This was home. This was the life she was choosing, and she was choosing it with open eyes and full heart. The rest of the day passed in a kind of joyful domesticity that felt both strange and wonderful. They inventoried the pantry together, planning meals for the coming weeks. They sorted through Sarah's things in the storage room, with Jonah giving Lillian some of the warmer clothes and boots she'd need for Wyoming winters, and packing away the more personal items for the boys to have someday. They talked about practical matters, where Lillian's equipment would be stored, how they'd arrange the house to give her space for her work, when they'd make the trip to town to send telegrams and letters. The boys shadowed Lillian's every move, still seeming to need physical confirmation of her presence. She found she didn't mind. After years of living alone in her Boston apartment, coming home to empty rooms and solitary meals, the constant company felt like wealth rather than burden. That evening, after supper and after the boys were in bed, Lillian and Jonah sat together by the fire with coffee and comfortable silence. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving the world blanketed in pristine white that glowed faintly in the starlight. When spring comes, Jonah said quietly, we should get married. Give you time to settle in, to be sure, but not so much time that people start talking about impropriety. Small ceremony? Lillian asked. Very small. Just us and the boys and maybe a few neighbors. Unless you want something bigger? Small sounds perfect. I don't need a crowd of witnesses. I just need you and the boys and the promise that we're building a life together. You'll have that. You already have that. They sat in peaceful silence, watching the fire burn down to coals, and Lillian thought about all the choices that had led her to this moment. The choice to pursue education when it wasn't expected. The choice to come west for research when colleagues warned against it. The choice to stay through a blizzard instead of insisting on leaving. And finally, the choice to remain, to build a life here, to love these four males who needed her as much as she needed them. Every choice had mattered. Every choice had brought her here, to this ranch, to this family, to this profound sense of rightness that she'd never felt anywhere else. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For seeing me. Really seeing me. Not just the scientist or the Eastern lady or the potential mother for your children. You see all of me, and you love all of me. That's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. Jonah reached over and took her hand, threading their fingers together. Then we're even. Because you saw me too. Not just the grieving widower or the struggling rancher, but the man underneath. You gave me permission to hope again, to love again, to believe that life could be more than just endurance. Outside, an owl called across the frozen landscape, and somewhere in the house, a board creaked as it settled. Inside, by the dying fire, two people who'd found each other against all odds held hands and looked toward a future that would be difficult and beautiful and absolutely worth choosing. And upstairs, three boys slept peacefully for the first time in months, knowing that come morning, Miss Lillian would still be there, that she'd chosen them, that their family, broken for so long, was finally beginning to heal. The storm had passed, spring would come, and when it did, they'd all be together, building something new from the pieces of their broken hearts. A family forged not by blood or obligation, but by choice, by love, by the simple, profound decision to stay. Winter released its grip on Wyoming slowly, reluctantly, as if testing whether spring truly deserved to claim the land. The deep snows melted into rushing creeks that sang through the valley, and the first brave shoots of grass pushed through the cold earth like small green miracles. Lillian watched the transformation from the porch of the house that was now undeniably home, coffee cup warming her hands in the sharp morning air, and marveled at how much could change in just a few months. The letters she'd sent to Boston in late December had produced exactly the responses she'd expected. Professor Williams had written back with barely concealed disappointment, suggesting she was allowing personal circumstances to override professional judgment, and warning that such decisions would severely limit future opportunities in academic circles. Her father's letter had been worse, pages of recrimination about wasted education, foolish choices, and throwing away her potential for some rancher in the wilderness. He'd closed by saying he hoped she'd come to her senses before it was too late, as if love and commitment were temporary insanity rather than deliberate choice. Only Dr. Chen from the museum had offered anything approaching support, writing that some of the most important scientific work has been done by those willing to follow their passion wherever it leads, even if that means leaving traditional paths behind. She'd added that the museum would gladly consider any papers Lillian wished to submit, and that geographical location mattered far less than quality of research. Lillian had read that letter aloud to Jonah, her voice breaking with gratitude, and he'd held her while she cried for the support she hadn't realized she desperately needed. One person believing in her choice had somehow made all the other dismissals more bearable. "Miss Lillian!" Luke's voice carried from the barn, high and excited. "The new calf is standing! Come see!" She set down her cup and headed across the muddy yard, her boots, Sarah's boots, now hers, squelching in the spring thaw. Inside the barn, the boys clustered around a wobbly-legged calf that was indeed standing, nuzzling its patient mother while Jonah watched with the satisfaction of a man who'd successfully guided the birth through a difficult night. "She's beautiful," Lillian said, genuinely moved by the new life. "What will you name her?" "We thought maybe Hope," Micah said, glancing at his father for approval. Because she was born in spring, when everything starts over new. Hope is perfect. Lillian met Jonah's eyes over the boys' heads, and they shared a look that needed no words. Everything was starting over new. Not just the season, but their lives, their family, their carefully reconstructed hearts. The weeks following her decision to stay had been an exercise in adjustment and discovery. Lillian had learned the rhythms of ranch life, the endless cycle of feeding and mending and maintaining that kept a homestead functioning. She'd discovered muscles she didn't know she had blistered and calloused her hands, had learned to read weather and livestock and the 100 small signs that told whether things were going well or needed attention. But she'd also continued her research with a freedom she'd never had in Boston. The rock formations on McCrae Land were yielding extraordinary finds. A nearly complete fish fossil from the Cretaceous, several excellent examples of ammonites, and trace fossils that showed ancient creature movement patterns. She'd set up a makeshift laboratory in one of the unused outbuildings, where she could clean and catalog specimens without worrying about damaging the house. And Jonah had surprised her by being an invaluable research partner. His knowledge of the land meant he could guide her to formations she'd have missed, could read erosion patterns and identify likely fossil sites with an intuition born from years of observation. Together, they'd developed a system. She provided the scientific knowledge, he provided the practical wisdom, and their combined efforts produced work that was better than either could have done alone. "I've been thinking," Jonah said now, running a hand along the calf's flank to check its warmth. "We should ride out to the northern section this afternoon. The spring runoff's exposing new rock layers that might interest you." "Can we come?" Owen asked immediately. "Not this time, son. You three need to finish the fence repairs on the south pasture. But Miss Lillian will bring back anything interesting to show you." The boys accepted this with only minor grumbling, accustomed now to the division of labor that kept the ranch running. They'd grown in confidence over the winter months, had started laughing more freely, had begun to imagine futures that included joy as well as duty. Luke still had nightmares sometimes, crying for his mother in the dark, but now Lillian was there to comfort him, to hold him while he grieved, and remind him that loving her didn't mean forgetting Sarah. That afternoon, Lillian and Jonah rode out together under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The horses picked their way carefully through mud and melting snow, and Lillian gloried in the simple pleasure of being outdoors, doing work she loved with the man she loved beside her. They reached the northern exposure, and Lillian immediately saw what Jonah meant. The runoff had carved away overlying sediment, revealing fresh rock face that showed beautiful stratification. She dismounted and approached with her tools, her practiced eye already identifying promising layers. "Here," she said, brushing away loose material. "See this darker band? That's likely rich in organic material, and these ripple marks suggest this was near-shore environment, which means potential for— oh!" Her careful excavation had revealed the edge of something larger, something that made her heart race with the thrill of discovery. She worked for the next hour, while Jonah watched and occasionally handed her tools, patient as she freed a spectacular ammonite from its stone prison. The fossilized shell was nearly a foot across, perfectly preserved, every chamber visible in exquisite detail. "Lillian, that's incredible," Jonah breathed, genuine awe in his voice. "It's more than incredible. It's publication-worthy. This specimen alone could anchor a paper on marine fossil distribution in this region." She sat back on her heels, cradling the ammonite like a treasure. "Jonah, this is what I came here for. This is the work that matters." "Do you regret it?" The question came quietly. "Staying here instead of returning to Boston with finds like this? You could have presented this to the university, enhanced your reputation." Lillian looked at him, this good man who still worried he wasn't enough, who still feared she'd wake up one day and realize she'd traded too much for too little. "I regret nothing. In Boston, this would be cataloged and studied and eventually locked in a museum drawer. Here, this is going home with us to show 3 boys who'll be thrilled beyond measure. Luke will want to draw it. Micah will want to know how old it is. Owen will ask questions about what it means for understanding ancient climate. That's worth more to me than any university presentation." "You say that now, I say that always." She stood and moved to him, the ammonite still in her hands. "Jonah, I need you to hear this. I chose this life with clear eyes and full knowledge of what I was trading. Some days I miss the museums and libraries. Some days I wish I had colleagues nearby to discuss findings with. But I have never, not once, regretted choosing you and the boys. This life we're building, it's not second best or settling. It's first choice. It's what I want. He pulled her close, careful of the fossil between them, and kissed her with a tenderness that still made her breath catch. I love you, Dr. Lillian Price. I love you too, Mr. Jonah McCrae. Soon to be just Jonah McCrae, once you make an honest woman of me. About that. He pulled back, suddenly looking nervous in a way she'd never seen. I know we said spring, but I was thinking, what about next week? Pastor Morrison's coming through town on his monthly circuit. We could do it simple. Just us and the boys and maybe the Hendersons from the neighboring ranch as witnesses. If that's too soon, next week is perfect. Lillian felt joy bubble up in her chest. I'm ready, Jonah. I've been ready. They rode back to the ranch with the ammonite wrapped carefully in cloth, with plans forming and hearts light. The boys erupted with excitement when they heard the news, immediately demanding details about the ceremony and what they'd wear and whether there'd be cake. Miss Lillian, Owen said that evening after his brothers had finally settled down, his tone serious in that way that meant he had something important to say. When you and Pa get married, you'll be our stepmother officially. But we were wondering, we want to keep calling you Miss Lillian. Is that all right? We don't want you to think we don't respect you as our new mother. It's just that I'm not trying to replace your mama, and you want to honor her memory by keeping her title sacred, Lillian finished gently. Owen, I understand completely. Miss Lillian is perfect. It acknowledges our relationship without disrespecting Sarah's place in your hearts. I'm honored you thought about it so carefully. Relief flooded his young face. Pa said you'd understand, but I wanted to make sure. Some of the boys at church say their stepmothers make them call them mother, even when they don't want to. Well, I'm not some of their stepmothers. I'm me, and we get to define our family however works best for us. She pulled him into a hug, this boy who carried too much responsibility too young, but was slowly learning to just be 11 again. I promise you, loving me and loving your mama aren't mutually exclusive. Your hearts are big enough for both. The week passed in a flurry of preparation. Lillian had one decent dress suitable for a wedding, a deep green wool that brought out her eyes. The boys scrubbed until they shone and practiced standing still, which Luke found nearly impossible. Jonah arranged everything with quiet efficiency, and if he seemed nervous, well, that made two of them. The night before the wedding, Lillian sat up late writing in her journal by lamplight. She'd been documenting her research and her life in Wyoming, creating a record that might someday be useful to other scientists, or simply to her own future self. Tonight she wrote not about fossils, but about love, about choosing a life that made her whole rather than a life that made her acceptable to people whose approval she no longer needed. A knock on her door interrupted her writing. Come in. Jonah entered, looking uncertain. I know it's not proper for me to be here the night before the wedding, but I needed to make sure you're certain. There's still time to change your mind, Lillian. No shame in it if you've realized this isn't what you want. Sit down, Jonah. She patted the bed beside her, and he sat carefully, leaving proper space between them. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it. For the past 3 months, I've been living the life I'll have after we marry. Caring for your sons, managing this household, doing my research from this ranch. I've experienced the reality, not just the romance, and I'm still here, still certain, still choosing this. Even knowing you'll be isolated out here, that winter will trap us for months at a time, that this life is hard and often lonely and never glamorous. I grew up in Boston society, where women in beautiful dresses attended parties and gossiped about each other and lived lives of suffocating propriety. That was glamorous, and I hated every minute of it. This life might be hard, but it's real. It's mine. That's worth more than easy elegance ever could be. What about your father? He still hasn't accepted your choice. My father loved my mother, and when she died, he never remarried. He poured himself into his ministry and raising me, and he forgot how to imagine life beyond duty. I understand why my choices frighten him. They're so different from anything he knows. But Jonah, I can't live my life trying to earn approval from someone who's fundamentally unable to give it. I have to make my own peace and hope that someday he'll make his. Jonah took her hand, his rough thumb tracing circles on her palm. Tomorrow, I'm going to stand in front of witnesses and promise to love and cherish you for the rest of my life. I need you to know that I take that seriously. You're not just getting me, you're getting 3 boys who need a mother, a ranch that requires constant work, and a life that will never be easy. But you'll also get my whole heart, such as it is. Everything I have to give is yours. And everything I have is yours. My mind, my heart, my stubborn refusal to give up when things get difficult, my terrible cooking, my good research, my fierce love for you and your sons. All of it, Jonah. I'm giving you all of it. He leaned forward and kissed her softly, then stood to leave. At the door, he turned back. Thank you for choosing us, for seeing something worth staying for in a broke rancher and his broken boys. You're not broken. You're healing. There's a difference. She smiled. And tomorrow, we'll keep healing together. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of early spring day that promised better things ahead. Lillian dressed with care, her hands steady despite the flutter in her stomach. When she came downstairs, she found 3 boys in their Sunday best waiting with barely contained excitement. You look beautiful, Miss Lillian, Micah said shyly. Like a princess, Luke added. Owen just smiled, but his eyes were bright with emotion. They rode into Sweetwater in the wagon, the boys chattering nervously while Jonah kept his eyes on the road and his jaw tight. At the small church, Pastor Morrison waited with the Hendersons, a middle-aged couple who'd been kind to the McCrays after Sarah's death, and who seemed genuinely happy to witness this new beginning. The ceremony was simple and short, just as Lillian had wanted. No elaborate vows, no orchestrated performance for society, just 2 people making promises to each other while 3 boys watched with hope-bright faces and 2 neighbors smiled their approval. Do you, Jonah McCray, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward? I do. His voice was steady, his eyes never leaving Lillian's face. And do you, Lillian Price, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward? I do. She said it clearly, firmly, with no hesitation or doubt. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Jonah's kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise. When they pulled apart, Luke was crying happy tears. Micah was grinning so wide his face might split, and Owen was trying very hard to look mature and composed despite the emotion swimming in his eyes. They signed the marriage certificate, accepted congratulations from the Hendersons, and rode back to the ranch as a family. No longer separate pieces, but a whole unit bound by love and choice and legal commitment. That night, after a celebratory supper of the boys' favorite foods and a cake that Mrs. Henderson had kindly provided, Lillian found herself standing on the porch with Jonah, watching the sun set over the mountains. Mrs. McCray, he said, testing out her new name. How does it feel? Right. It feels absolutely right. She leaned against him, fitting perfectly under his arm. Though professionally, I'll still publish as Dr. Lillian Price. Need to maintain some continuity for my colleagues. The ones who think you've lost your mind? The very same. Though Dr. Chen wrote again last week, asking if I'd be willing to present a paper at the Western Regional Geological Conference this summer. Apparently my field notes on the marine fossils are generating interest. That's wonderful. Will you go? Only if you and the boys can come with me. I told you, no more sacrificing family for work or work for family. We do both together, or we figure out a different solution. I like that philosophy. He pulled her closer. Though I have to warn you, taking 3 boys to a scientific conference might not enhance your professional credibility. My professional credibility survived me marrying a rancher and moving to Wyoming. I think it can handle 3 well-behaved boys sitting through presentations. Who said anything about well-behaved? They laughed together, and inside the house the boys were supposed to be getting ready for bed, but were clearly celebrating in their own way, their voices carrying through the window in excited whispers and occasional shouts of joy. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. Lillian divided her time between research, household management, and teaching the boys, not just academic subjects but life skills and wonder at the world around them. She and Jonah worked together on both ranch tasks and geological surveys, their partnership deepening with each shared experience. In May, a letter arrived from Boston that Lillian opened with trepidation. But instead of more recrimination, she found an unexpected surprise. Dr. Chen had submitted one of Lillian's papers to the Geological Society Journal, and it had been accepted for publication. The editor included a note saying they were pleased to see quality field research emerging from underexplored regions, and hoped Dr. Price would submit future findings. Lillian read the letter 3 times before she could fully believe it. Her work was being recognized. Her choice to stay hadn't ended her career. It had simply redirected it in ways that might actually be more meaningful than anything she could have done from a Boston laboratory. "Jonah!" She ran to find him in the barn, where he was working on harness repairs. "Look!" He read the letter, then pulled her into a spinning hug that made her laugh with pure joy. "I'm so proud of you. You did it, Lillian. You proved you can have both, the family and the work." "We did it. Together." She kissed him soundly. "Your field knowledge is in every observation I make. You're as much a part of this research as I am." "Does that make me a scientist?" "It makes you my partner. In every sense that matters." That evening, she shared the news with the boys, who celebrated with enthusiasm even though they didn't fully understand the significance. But they understood that Miss Lillian was happy, that her work mattered, and that she'd achieved something important while staying with them. That was enough. Summer arrived with warmth and long days perfect for both ranch work and fossil hunting. Lillian took the boys on regular expeditions, teaching them proper excavation techniques and the patience required for scientific work. Owen developed a particular talent for spotting promising formations. Micah loved the cataloging and drawing, creating detailed sketches of every find. Luke simply enjoyed the treasure hunt aspect, though his enthusiasm sometimes resulted in broken specimens that Lillian learned to accept with grace. In late June, they made the trip to Denver for the geological conference Dr. Chen had mentioned. The boys were on their best behavior, awed by the city and the Grand Hotel and the lecture halls filled with serious-looking scientists. Lillian presented her paper on marine fossil distribution in Wyoming territory to a room full of colleagues who listened with respect that bordered on surprise. During the question period, one older gentleman asked pointedly about her unique living situation and whether it interfered with serious scientific pursuit. Lillian had smiled and responded evenly. "My living situation provides daily access to some of the most geologically significant formations in this region, partnership with someone who understands the land better than any university-trained geologist, and the satisfaction of sharing scientific discovery with the next generation. I'd argue it enhances rather than interferes with my work." Dr. Chen had caught her afterwards with tears in her eyes. "That was magnificent. You handled Professor Sterling perfectly. He's been trying to undermine women in science for decades. And your research is solid, Lillian. You're doing important work out there. Thank you for believing in me when others didn't. Thank you for proving that there are multiple paths to meaningful scientific contribution. You're blazing a trail whether you intended to or not." On the train ride home, with the boys dozing in their seats and the Wyoming landscape rolling past, Jonah had taken Lillian's hand. "You were incredible up there, so confident, so knowledgeable. Those people respected you." "Some of them did. Others think I'm a curiosity or a cautionary tale. But you know what? I don't care anymore. I know the value of my work, and I know the value of my life. Their approval is nice when I get it, but it's not necessary for my happiness or my sense of worth." "When did you become so wise?" "When I married a man who taught me that strength comes in many forms, and that the opinion that matters most is your own." They'd arrived back at the ranch to find everything in order. The neighbors they'd hired to check on things had done their job well, and within an hour it was as if they'd never left. The boys scattered to check on their favorite animals and places. Jonah went to inspect the property, and Lillian stood on the porch breathing in the sage-scented air and feeling utterly, completely at home. Summer gave way to fall, and fall to the first hints of winter. On a crisp October evening, with snow threatening in the iron-gray sky, Lillian sat at the kitchen table working on a new paper while the boys did homework and Jonah worked on the ranch accounts. The scene was so domestic, so ordinary, that it took her a moment to recognize how extraordinary it actually was. A year ago, she'd been in Boston, fighting for respect in academic circles, lonely in her tiny apartment, wondering if she'd ever find a place where she truly belonged. Now she was here, surrounded by family, doing work that mattered, living a life that satisfied both her mind and her heart. "Miss Lillian?" Luke appeared at her elbow with his slate. "Is this arithmetic right?" She checked his work and found an error, gently showing him where he'd gone wrong. He corrected it with a frown of concentration, then beamed when he got it right. "Can I ask you something?" he said, not moving away. "Of course, sweetheart." "Do you ever miss your old life, before you came here?" The question caught her off guard with its perceptiveness. She set down her pen and pulled him onto her lap, even though he was getting big for such things. "Sometimes I miss specific things, museums, libraries, being able to attend lectures. But Luke, I don't miss my old life as a whole. This is better. This is where I belong. Even though we're not fancy like Boston, especially because you're not fancy. You're real and honest and true. That's worth more than all the fancy things in the world." He hugged her tight, and over his head, Lillian met Jonah's eyes. Her husband smiled at her with such love and gratitude that she felt her own eyes prick with tears. This was what mattered. This was what she'd chosen. And she'd choose it again, every single time. The first anniversary of her arrival at the ranch fell in early December, just days before Christmas. Lillian marked the date privately, thinking about everything that had changed in 12 short months. The woman who'd stepped off that train in Sweetwater, desperate to prove herself, armored against disappointment, so certain she knew what she wanted, seemed like a stranger now. She'd learned so much, that love doesn't diminish you, but expands you. That having it all doesn't mean excelling at everything simultaneously, but rather creating a life where all the pieces support each other. That family isn't just blood or just choice, but the complex weaving of both into something new and strong. Christmas that year was joyful in a way it hadn't been the year before. The house was warm with love and laughter, the tree decorated with the boys' enthusiastic help, the presents exchanged with genuine delight. But the best gift was simply being together, whole and healed and happy. On Christmas night, after the boys were asleep and the house was quiet, Lillian and Jonah sat on the porch, despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and watching the stars. "A year ago tonight, I asked you to stay," Jonah said quietly. "Just one word. Please." It was all I could manage. "A year ago tonight, I was terrified I was making the wrong choice, that I was giving up too much for too little return. And now I know the truth. I wasn't giving anything up. I was trading one version of success for another, much better version. The life I have now, with you and the boys, with my work and my purpose, this is what fulfillment actually looks like. Not achievement for achievement's sake, but contribution that matters to real people in real time. Do you think Sarah would approve?" The question came hesitantly, but Lillian had been expecting it. "I think Sarah loved you and the boys enough to want you to be happy. I think she'd be glad you found someone who loves her children and honors her memory. And I think she'd approve of me continuing the work she started, raising boys who are kind and curious and brave enough to love, despite knowing loss." "Sometimes I talk to her," Jonah admitted, "in my head, thanking her for the years we had, for the boys, for teaching me how to love so I could do it again with you. Does that seem strange?" "Not at all. She's part of your story, part of this family's story. Acknowledging that doesn't diminish what we have. It honors where we came from." They sat in comfortable silence, and above them the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, the same stars that had witnessed geological time and human drama for eons. Lillian thought about deep time, about the fossils she studied that were messages from unimaginable distances in the past. And she thought about how her own life was a message to the future, proof that women could choose unconventional paths and find fulfillment, that love could bloom in unexpected places, that family could be built from broken pieces and become whole again. Inside the house, Luke cried out in his sleep, and both Lillian and Jonah moved to rise, but they heard Owen's voice, soft and comforting, and the crying stopped. Their oldest son, taking care of his brother, the family she and Jonah had built, functioning even in their absence. "They're going to be all right," Jonah said with wonder. "All three of them. They're going to grow up and be all right." Better than all right. They're going to be extraordinary, and we get to watch it happen. We get to help it happen. He pulled her closer under the blanket. Thank you, Lillian, for staying, for choosing us, for making this house feel like home again. Thank you for asking me to stay, for seeing past the prickly Eastern scientist to the woman underneath who was desperate to belong somewhere. They went inside as the cold deepened, checked on the boys who were all sleeping peacefully, and retired to their own room. In the morning, there would be chores and work and all the ordinary business of living. But tonight there was only this: two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd chosen love over fear and connection over safety, who'd built a family from grief and hope and stubborn determination. Lillian lay in bed beside her husband, listening to the house settle and the wind whisper outside, and felt peace settle into her bones. She'd come to Wyoming seeking ancient secrets locked in stone. She'd found those, certainly. Her research was flourishing in ways that made her Boston colleagues take notice. But she'd also found something far more precious: a home, a family, a life where mind and heart existed in harmony instead of competition. The Christmas storm a year ago hadn't just trapped her here. It had delivered her home. And now, looking toward the future with clear eyes and full heart, Lillian knew that every choice she'd made had led her exactly where she needed to be. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting down to blanket the ranch in white. But inside the McCrae house, her house now, her home, warmth and love and possibility glowed like lamplight against the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. There would be hard days and easy ones, triumphs and setbacks, moments of doubt and moments of absolute certainty. But through it all, there would be this: 4 people who'd been broken finding wholeness together. 3 boys learning that love could survive loss. 1 man discovering he had room in his heart for second chances. And 1 woman proving that the greatest discoveries weren't always found in ancient stone, but sometimes in the courage to choose an unexpected path and follow it home. The wind sang through the eaves, and in the darkness, Lillian smiled. She'd come to study rocks that remembered ancient seas. She'd stayed because she'd found something worth remembering forever. The moment when everything she thought she wanted gave way to everything she actually needed. And she was brave enough to claim it. That was the real treasure. That was the discovery that mattered most. And as sleep claimed her, wrapped in Jonah's arms with her family safe around her, Lillian whispered a quiet thanks to the storm that had brought her here. To the boys who'd opened their hearts. To the man who'd asked her to stay. And to her own courageous choice to say yes to a life she'd never imagined, but could no longer imagine living without. Under the wide Wyoming sky, the ranch settled into winter's embrace. And inside its walls, a family slept peacefully, whole and healed and home at last.